Hey guys. This is part 2 of What If Naruto Was Reincarnated as Harry Potter. Hit like and subscribe if you like this one, and also please check the author in the description. Let's start.
We are pain, that's all. We are God.
Chapter 7, to Hogwarts. When Harry had first learned that all of the children attending Hogwarts went directly to King's Cross Station in London, then took a train to Hogwarts, he had been incredulous. Even for those who lived in London, it was an agonizingly inconvenient process, given the existence of multiple nearly instantaneous methods of magical travel. Add in those students who lived closer to Hogwarts than London, and it was even worse. In fact, as the only fully magical village, there would on average be more students coming from Hogsmeade itself than from any other single location in Britain. So those students would travel from Hogsmeade to London, then spend most of the day traveling by train all the way back to end up where they left that morning. But after actually taking the train, Harry began to understand how such a seemingly insane tradition came into being. It was the perfect situation to allow the new students to bond. Create the beginnings of what would be important friendships for years, hopefully anyway. Or to renew such friendships for returning students, he supposed. So as the train finally came to a stop in Hogsmeade Village, long after dark, Harry was still laughing with his new friends as they wandered out of the train and towards Hogwarts. All of them could do with some maturing in various ways, but that was to be expected, given their ages. Harry was just trying to live a real childhood, something he never had as Naruto, so he tried his best to not let Hermione's pushiness, Neville's excessive shyness, or Ron's overly brash and occasionally abrasive manner bother him, but it was a work in progress. First years over here. All right there, Harry? Hagrid's booming voice interrupted his thoughts. Harry grinned and dragged his new friends over towards the huge man. Hey Hagrid! Doing well, how are you? Oh, this is Hermione, Ron, and Neville. They're first years like me. Each of them greeted the man with various levels of wide-eyed shock. Hagrid quickly nodded towards them, then said, Good to meet all of ya. Have to talk later though. For now just follow me down to the lake. He then raised his already naturally loud voice to its previous truly booming level as he yelled out once more time. All right. First years follow me. Come on first years. He led the group of first years away from the rest of the students, and down a fairly steeply sloping path from the small train platform with only Hagrid's tiny lantern to light the way. Or at least it seemed tiny in the man's huge hand, and didn't supply nearly enough light for most of the children to see the rocky ground. Of course Harry could see fine in anything short of absolute darkness, but he did have to catch the others a few times, especially Neville, who was a little on the clumsy side. But that wasn't what he was putting most of his attention to. No, it was the two men under some kind of invisibility spell hiding in the bushes off to the side of the path. Though actually, as they got closer, Harry could tell that it wasn't really an invisibility spell directly on the men, but rather that they were under some kind of object with the invisibility spell on it. A cloak, most likely, from what Harry could tell about the origins of the magic he could see with his Sharingan. But what concerned him even more than two men apparently in hiding for a group of small children was that they started sending some kind of subtle spell at each of the first years as they went past. They had ignored Hagrid though, which seemed to indicate it wasn't immediately harmful magic, at least. If they were going for an outright attack, they certainly would have targeted the obvious threat of Hagrid first. Instead they were just going for the children. Strange. So Harry just watched as several of the students ahead of him were hit. They didn't seem to notice anything, or exhibit any reaction at all to whatever the spell was. And Harry couldn't tell what it was doing either. It was far too complicated for Harry's limited knowledge of magic. If he had to guess, he would say this was the trace spell for tracking underage magic he had read was placed on all 11-year-olds before they started learning magic. But one thing he did know was that regardless of what it did, he wasn't going to allow it to take hold of him. Because whatever it did, it was connecting directly with each of the students' chakra coils. Or magical core, as they called it now. He had no idea why it would do that, but he had seen it happen once before. To himself, to be precise. At some point before his souls had joined, some sort of monstrously complex magical spell had established itself, linking directly into his chakra coils. To this day, he had no idea what the thing was or what it did, but it was probably over 100 times as complicated and powerful as whatever those two men were casting. So of course Harry had moved it. He had wanted to destroy it outright, but he had been pretty sure that at least part of the spell included some sort of link to some other spell elsewhere. So damaging the spell might have informed someone that something was wrong. So instead he just moved it over into his cousin Dudley. Of course Dudley's chakra coils were an incredibly pathetic thing, but that didn't seem to matter. The spell didn't actually draw any magic, or at least not in its standard passive state. It just needed to be connected to the chakra coils. And Dudley's coils worked for that, pathetic barely their things or not. Based on reading his Introduction to Magic book, he was pretty sure Dudley qualified as what they called a squib, as did Aunt Petunia. Unlike most people, they did have excess spiritual energy, just not enough to actually power even the weakest of spells. The moving of the spell had been ridiculously difficult though. It had taken him 6 months to figure out how, carefully pry the thing away from where it was partially merged with his chakra coils, and gently shift the thing into Dudley. He refused to go through that again. Granted, it would be significantly faster with this new spell, given his experience and this one's lesser complexity. But it still wasn't something he wanted to go through again, so he just tore the spell apart with his chakra as it approached him, and did the same for those aimed at Hermione, Ron, and Neville while he was at it. The people hiding didn't seem to notice anything was wrong, so he just gave a tiny shrug and continued down the path to where a group of small boats were tied up at the edge of a large lake. But there were much more impressive things to see than the boats, because Hogwarts itself came into view just as they came around the final bend in the path. Harry gasped along with everyone else as they fell silent and stared on wonder. Though he would guess that his gasp was for a very different reason. The architecture, landscaping, and view of the castle were nothing particularly spectacular to Harry. He had seen plenty of sights that equaled or surpassed Hogwarts in that regard. He could probably make its equal himself in a day or so between a lot of clones and even more earth manipulation. No, what shocked Harry was the amount of natural energy running through the area around Hogwarts, and in fact through the castle itself. Mount Myaboku was the only place he had ever seen with an equal level of natural energy. Even from where Harry was standing, he could tell that the levels were elevated beyond the normal amounts, but the amounts running through the castle itself were truly incredible. But Harry forced himself to shake off his awe after a few moments as he turned to Ron, having realized the red-headed boy said something while he was distracted. "What was that, Ron?" "Oh, I said it was pretty incredible, isn't it, mate?" Ron responded. Harry just nodded as he stared for a few more seconds. This would be something he would have to look into more carefully. That level of natural energy had to be important in some way, and might make some of Harry's projects easier as well. The most important of which would be making another attempt to contact the Toads from here. His earlier attempts over the years since his souls joined had all been met with total failure, and he had no idea why. Hopefully he would have greater success from an area of such rich natural energy. He could consider that and other possible uses for this much natural energy later though. "Yeah, it's pretty amazing," he answered Ron. "Anyway, come on. Let's grab a boat." "No more N4 to a boat," Hagrid yelled out as the group slowly approached the waiting boats. Harry quickly claimed one of them and helped the other three carefully climb in without tipping the thing over. "Everyone in?" shouted Hagrid, who had claimed one boat to himself, and even then almost dropped the edge below the water level from his weight. Upon seeing that everyone had settled into at least reasonably safe positions, he yelled out, "All right then. Forward!" The trip across was not particularly fast, and the surface of the lake was as smooth as glass. Not to mention that the students were mostly silent as they looked up at the castle. So of course Harry was pretty bored. Harry could fix that though. So he looked over to Malfoy's boat briefly and put a band of thickened air around one of Malfoy's bodyguards. Harry didn't even know which one, but it didn't matter as he forced the boy's arm to jerk up and blatantly shove Malfoy out of the boat and into the water. It was probably just an excuse at this point, but he had seen Malfoy looking down his nose as he refused some girl who had asked to join Malfoy and his two goons in their boat. Was it petty? Sure. Was it immature? Almost certainly. Was it small-minded? Probably yes, he was sure he had been going somewhere with this at some point. Oh well. It was funny, which was mostly what Harry cared about. And most of the other students seemed to agree, as most were at least snickering as Malfoy floundered in the water and yelled for help. Even Hagrid's beard seemed to twitch as if he was trying to repress his smile as he grabbed the back of Malfoy's dripping robes and dropped the soaked boy back into his boat. "You all right there?" Hagrid asked Malfoy with at least a little genuine concern. Upon receiving a hesitant and still shocked nod, Hagrid turned to the boy who had shoved him. "Gregory Goyle. I haven't seen something like that in all my years taking the first years cross the lake. I'll speak to your head of house once you get one, ya can believe that. Yeah, do it again, and I might just have ya swim the rest of the way too." This was enough to bring Malfoy out of his shock, and the boy began to shriek in a rather unpleasantly high-pitched voice something about how Goyle could dare to do something like that, and of course how his father would hear about it. This brought the other boy out of his own shock as he began to hesitantly try to explain that he hasn't meant to, or something along those lines. It was mostly lost in Malfoy's much angrier and shriller diatribe, and Harry wasn't really paying attention to their words anyway. Malfoy's limply hanging hair that was once so carefully coiffed and equally soaked expensive silk robes were just too amusing. After landing the boats and walking up a path to Hogwarts, Hagrid knocked on a very solid wooden door and handed off the first years to a very stern-looking woman who was introduced as Professor McGonagall. McGonagall then escorted them all into the huge entrance hall and gave a welcome to Hogwarts along with a spectacularly uninformative introduction to the sorting and the houses, which effectively did nothing more than name the houses. Her suggestion that they smarten themselves up while staring at Malfoy's imitation of a soaked cat was pretty funny though. She then left the group of first years alone in the entrance hall as she entered through the door opposite the one the group had entered the castle through. A few of the students started to nervously chatter among themselves, mostly over conjecture about what the sorting ceremony would be. Harry wasn't concerned though, so he decided to use this time to see more of the castle. Not waiting any longer, he switched his eyes from their current Sharingan to the Byakugan. The Byakugan was one of the 3 eye-based bloodlines he had taken during his life as Naruto, and the last he had obtained. It had been the only one of the 3 he had gotten after the 4th Great Shinobi World War, in fact. Hayashi Hyuga really should have known better than to try and organize an assassination attempt against him though. After Hayashi had stepped down in favor of his daughter Hinata taking over as the clan head of the Hyuga, he and the rest of the Hyuga elders had objected rather strongly against Hinata abolishing the caged bird seal on the branch family of the Hyuga. Of course neither he nor Hinata particularly cared what that group of useless old men thought, so they had gone ahead with it. Naruto had actually empathized with Hayashi's position to some extent, as the rest of the elders had been in favor of assassinating Hinata rather than him. Hayashi had pushed for Naruto's death as the only living seal master skilled enough to remove the caged bird seal rather than trying to kill Hinata, which Naruto appreciated. Still, he couldn't let the attempted assassination of their own Hokage go, so he had to execute all of the elders, including using his bloodline theft seal to take the strongest of the elders' Byakugans, that of Hayashi Hyuga. Though as much as him having to execute Hinata's father had bothered him at the time, he did have to admit that there being no surviving Hyuga elders had greatly simplified her job of running and modernizing the Hyuga clan. He sometimes debated if he should have bothered with obtaining the Byakugan though. The Byakugan granted the ability to see with 360-degree vision, see through solid objects, and see long distances up to about 10 miles for him, though he had never approached the mastery Hinata had eventually achieved with the Byakugan. All of these things were useful, but rarely more useful than the abilities of either the Sharingan or the Rinnegan, so he rarely activated this particular eye. But he did now, and he immediately regretted it. Whoever had built Hogwarts was as insane as they were brilliant. The spatial distortion which had gone into the building was beyond incredible. Everywhere the space of rooms and hallways had been expanded or otherwise distorted, leaving something that made an Escher painting seem downright childish. Space overlapped and passed through itself in ways that should have been impossible. Straight hallways that should have crossed each other instead passed above or below each other. Full-sized rooms filled the space within a single wall, or even the same space as other rooms. Things impossible in 3 dimensions layered on top of each other in impossible ways, and all of this his Byakugan eyes tried to take in and make sense of in the span of a single second. Worse, he had switched to them with a fair amount of chakra flowing to his eyes, which meant he saw everything around him for miles all at once, rather than a much smaller few hundred feet with the minimum chakra needed to activate the eyes. This normally wasn't much of a problem. He had trained himself to be able to take in enormous amounts of visual information extremely quickly, but this was just too much. As his eyes tried to sort out what he was seeing, a spike of agony was sent straight into his brain as Harry desperately cut off all chakra flow to his eyes before he passed out. He was hardly surprised to find himself on the floor, as he slowly regained his bearings. The blood dripping from his eyes was a bit of a shock though. He knew that the Sharingan could produce that bleeding from the eyes effect when they were pushed beyond their capacity, but it had never happened with the Byakugan that he was aware of. The various screams and yells of the surrounding children probably should have been expected too, though with his sudden migraine, they were not particularly appreciated. Harry! Harry, are you all right? He managed to discern Hermione's frantic yelling from all the others, so he slowly nodded to her and pushed himself upright off of the ground into a sitting position. Yeah, sorry about that. That was weird. Harry carefully wiped away the blood running down his cheeks and pushed himself back to his feet. At the moment his eyes had taken enough damage that anyone else would have been blind, and his headache, if it could be called that, was severe enough most would be unconscious. It was hardly the first time something like that had happened to him though, even in this lifetime. And the healing provided by his own bloodline, accelerated by the power of the Juubi flowing through him, should fix that up within the next couple hours. Unfortunately, damage to his eyes always healed the slowest, given their enormous complexity between all 3 of his eye-based bloodlines. He could regrow limbs faster than he could heal even moderate damage to his eyes. Yet another reason to sometimes regret the inclusion of the Byakugan, since it slowed that process further for relatively little gain. But until then, the blurry shapes around him wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Anyone trained to fight blind could maneuver through a world that was merely dim and fuzzy without trouble. And his impressive levels of pain tolerance could handle the rest. Even Hermione's shrieking, which sent enough pain lancing from his ears that he used chakra to lessen his sense of hearing for the time being. Weird? You passed out and started bleeding out of your eyes. We need to get you to a doctor. Harry, now upright and as composed as ever, though his robes were slightly wrinkled now, gave his best rakish grin as he responded. Yeah, but I'm fine now. Oh look! Ghosts! He pointed casually at the floating specters which had approached the group while they all stared at Harry. This distracted people enough to take their focus away from Harry at least for the moment. There were even quite a few more screams, which surprised Harry. For at least those who grew up in the magical world, ghosts shouldn't be particularly frightening. Just from reading his introduction to the Magical World book, Harry knew that Hogwarts was apparently crawling with the things, and they were not exactly uncommon in other magical areas either. So Harry just let their words pass over him as he focused on his slowly healing eyes and clearing headache until McGonagall returned. Fortunately, his vision did clear up at least enough to briefly activate his Rinnegan with the ghosts still in view, even if they were a bit blurry. Ever since he read about ghosts, he had been quite curious. The Rinnegan could actually see souls, among other things, but he hadn't been sure if the ghosts he read about in his Introduction to Magic book were truly the souls of the dead somehow barred from continuing on to the afterlife or something else. It turned out after a brief examination with the Rinnegan that they were something else. There were no actual souls there, just a complicated and confusing mass of magic. In fact, it was rather similar to the magic he had seen on some of the moving paintings along the walls of Hogwarts, though significantly less structured. Which probably meant it was just some sort of accidental magic spell released as a witch or wizard desperately tried to use their magic to preserve their lives when they were dying. Or possibly even just some natural effect in areas of high concentrations of natural energy when the excess spiritual energy witches and wizards had was released on their death. Harry wasn't really sure, and honestly didn't care much. Either way, it meant they were a magical structure which contained at least some of the memories of the person who died. What he was interested in is if he could force the effect to take place with a living person and if he could access the memories stored within a ghost. Currently, his most effective method of information gathering was to literally rip someone's soul out with the power of the Rinnegan and absorb the knowledge of that person. Which killed them, obviously. And that was unfortunate. There had been far too many times he wanted to get at someone's knowledge without actually killing them. This seemed a likely avenue to do so. It would also be a much faster and easier method of learning magic while he was at it, though that would likely make his classes at Hogwarts even more boring than they were already going to be. So he was hesitant, but still interested in at least having the option. Move along now, McGonagall stated in her standard humorless voice and slightly pinched expression as she once again emerged from the Great Hall, this time leaving the door behind her open. That woman was far too uptight to be the head of Gryffindor, as he had heard she was. Gryffindor was supposed to be almost as famous for its pranksters and parties as it was for its members being stupidly brave. Excessive sternness was always a terrible method of dealing with such things, especially among those brave enough to ignore the warnings of teachers. If he got his wish to be in her house, by the time he was done with this school she would be forced to either loosen up or possibly have a psychotic break. Hopefully it would be the first. People always got annoyed when he caused psychotic breaks. He had only caused one in the past decade though, which was pretty good for him. He was sure Sakura would have been proud. Or some approximation of proud, at least. The kind of proud that came with beatings. Sometimes he wondered why he missed Sakura so much. The sorting ceremony's about to start, McGonagall continued, hopefully without any idea of what Harry was currently thinking. Now form a line and follow me. As they walked towards the door McGonagall had opened, Hermione guided Harry's elbow and whispered to him once again. Are you sure you are all right, Harry? Secretly Harry was thankful for her assistance, but he made sure he didn't put any weight on Hermione's grasp. He did stop sending chakra to his eyes to keep his Rinnegan active though. His eyes would heal more quickly if none of his eye bloodlines were activated. Not that anyone else could tell the difference behind the seals and illusions hiding anything out about his eyes. Yeah, he whispered back. I'm fine now. I can talk to the nurse later if you want, but I don't want to miss the sorting. Besides, the nurse is probably in there with everyone else anyway. If I do collapse again, she can help me there better than me going to an empty nurse's office would. I'm really fine though. In fact, he wouldn't be going to talk to the nurse, now or ever. He had no idea what magical detection methods magical healers had available, but there were concrete differences between his body and that of a normal 11-year-old which would be almost impossible to hide. putting an illusion over his eyes so that what was really a blood-red iris with rotating black geometric shapes looked like their normal bright green was one thing. If they had a spell which actually gave a detailed analysis of the composition and makeup of his eyes, even if they were inactive, his eyes would show as incredibly different from anything normally found in a human wizard or otherwise. And the rest of his body wasn't a lot better. Having chakra constantly flowing through his muscles and bones caused them to be slightly denser and actually structured a little differently. Again, it wasn't something that could be detected by an external view, but any detailed medical scan would detect it. And that wasn't even considering if they could do genetic scans. With all his bloodlines and some additional mutations because of the power of the Juubi flowing through him, he wasn't even sure if he technically qualified as human. He had once allowed Sakura to do a detailed medical analysis of him, and immediately had the thing destroyed. It had been an interesting read even for him though, and he would never be called anything remotely approaching a medical specialist. He had no desire for anyone to have similar knowledge of his physical makeup anytime soon. But Hermione hesitantly nodded and accepted Harry's explanation, with Neville seemed concerned as well. Though Ron appeared to have taken his reassurance at face value and was just looking around the room with interest. Fortunately, as they entered the Great Hall, even Hermione's attention was taken away from Harry and to the ceiling, which appeared to have been spelled to be transparent and allow a clear view of the night sky. It was probably more interesting to the others, but for Harry, it seemed that Hogwarts was the only place on Earth that he couldn't see through the ceiling whenever he wanted. Hermione certainly seemed impressed though, as she whispered informatively, "It's bewitched to look like the sky outside. I read about it in Hogwarts, a history." But Harry was just glad to have any distraction from his own condition as he continued to gather himself and rapidly heal. And fortunately, once in the Great Hall, what looked like an old and tattered hat provided further distraction as it sang a long and fairly ridiculous song which gave no information at all that Harry didn't already know, besides that the hat itself would apparently be doing the sorting. That was new, even for him though. A sentient hat whose sole purpose appeared to be to sort children once a year. Which seemed kind of pointless upon further thought. Of course he knew how to make sentient objects with seals, but he had never bothered much. There had been a brief period in which some of his children had gone a little overboard with making sentient weapons after he taught them how. His opinion that it was never worth it because the things were mostly just annoying rather than useful had eventually been proven correct though. It would be interesting to see if this sorting hat was any more useful than his own attempts at sentient creations. Harry was betting no. Chapter 8: The Useless Hat. Once the sorting hat song was complete, McGonagall began reading out each of the students' names, calling them up to sit on the stool and have the hat placed on their head, after which it would call out what house they were supposed to go into. Harry still had no idea how it was deciding which house, but it didn't really matter to him. If the hat wanted to dig through his head, it was going to fail. He had already seen many things magic might do better than chakra, but for pure brute force, chakra was simply much more powerful. And brute force that magic simply could not supply was what it would take to break through his mental defenses. He did make sure to memorize the names of each of his fellow first years and what house they went into for future reference though. For now, the only ones he really cared about were Hermione, then Neville, both of whom got sorted into Gryffindor, though both took longer than most of the other sortings. "Potter, Harry!" McGonagall called. Finally, it was his turn, and the rest of the hall fell silent in a way that they had not for any other name. Likely each was just now noticing his scar now that they knew to look for it on him. So Harry took these few moments of total silence to stride forward confidently towards the front of the Great Hall, which set off a wave of whispers rushing through the Great Hall. Harry just ignored it though. He was far too used to people whispering about him. Sometimes good things, sometimes terrible. It had taken quite a few years, but he had eventually gotten to the point that he just let it wash over him and barely even noticed. The only opinion that mattered to him now was that of his friends. So finally he reached the stool and sat down gracefully as McGonagall placed the hat over his head, allowing it to drop down over his eyes to rest on his nose. A long moment of silence passed before the hat stated, "If you could lower your occlumency barriers, that would be very helpful, Mr. Potter." The wave of whispers which had just barely finished dying down once more swept through the Great Hall at this pronouncement, with those students close enough to hear likely passing the words on to those further away. But Harry remained calm and responded with a firm voice. "I have no idea what occlumency barriers are." Technically he was lying. Although he had never heard the term occlumency before, given the context, he could assume the hat was trying to poke around in his brain, and had come up against the mind-walking shields Eno taught him to create so long ago. Harry was fine with the hat, and everyone else making whatever assumptions they wanted though. Interesting. Never heard of occlumency, you say? Could be a natural occlumens, I suppose. Though it doesn't feel quite right. If you are lying, there is no need. Anything I learn in your head is strictly confidential and used only for the purposes of sorting you. Harry almost laughed, though he was able to maintain his calm mask with some difficulty. The idea of the hat not reporting whatever interesting information it found digging around in his head was ridiculous. If it was as old as it looked and had been serving the purpose of sorting students for the entire history of Hogwarts about 1,000 years, from what he could gather, well, the concept of a right to privacy from one's lord didn't even exist back then. Not to mention that it would be downright irresponsible to not report information on a potentially dangerous student to the headmaster for the sake of everyone's safety. A student like him, in this case. No, he wasn't going to be opening his mind to the hat or anyone else anytime soon. The concept of a natural occlumens did seem useful though. Apparently some rare people were just naturally immune to people messing with their minds. That would be a useful excuse. Though he was curious why such a thing hadn't been mentioned in his Lost Powers book. It seemed like exactly the sort of unusual ability that would have fit into a book like that. He would have to look into what exactly an occlumens did at some later point. I'm not lying. Harry lied very sincerely. If I have these occlumency barriers, I don't know how to drop them. Fortunately, Harry had grown to be a rather talented liar in his lifetime as Naruto. It turned out that his overly enthusiastic happy mask he used in his childhood to draw attention had served as a strong basis in this field once he began to work on that particular area of his ninja skills shortly after the Fourth Great Shinobi World War. And like everything else he practiced, he had nothing if not time to perfect his skills. Well, I must warn you that I am required to test you on this. We had a rash of students with occlumency training claiming to be natural occlumens after the first real natural occlumens passed under my brim back in 1095, so I am required to call upon the power of Hogwarts itself to attempt to break your shields if you do not lower them now. If you are a natural occlumens, this won't hurt you, but if you are not, it will be quite painful. And whatever shields you have created will fail, I assure you. Harry gave a shrug and responded, I'm not doing anything. Or if I am, I don't know how to stop. So feel free to do whatever, I guess. Harry wasn't worried. As impressive as the natural energy flowing through Hogwarts was, it was no match for the power Harry contained. The last time he had done a rough calculation, including both the power of the Juubi and his own chakra, he housed roughly as much energy as a quarter of the entire planet's natural energy. The energy, highly concentrated or not, of one small valley was nothing in comparison. Granted, the majority of the total power contained within him was the Juubi's, and it would be bad if he had to start pulling on that chakra since using more than insignificant amounts of the Juubi's chakra had an immediate visible effect. Not to mention the inherent evil and corruption within the Juubi's chakra which even magic users would be able to sense if he started channeling significant amounts of it. He really didn't need questions about that coming up this early. It didn't end up being a problem though. The hat's attempts to invade his mind had started as a scalpel trying to cut away his shields. Unfortunately, scalpels were not particularly effective against what was the mental equivalent of a 50-foot thick wall of steel. Adding the power of Hogwarts to the attempt was a little like putting that scalpel onto the front of a tank and driving it full speed into the wall. Impressive, but still totally ineffective. Finally, the hat gave a long sigh and stated, Very well, Mr. Potter. I cannot sort you. The standard method of sorting natural occlumens is to have a meeting with the heads of the houses to discuss what house you would best fit. Just put me in Gryffindor, please. Harry responded politely but firmly. There was a short pause before the hat answered. I cannot sort you, Mr. Potter. I cannot get past the barriers in your mind, even with the power of the Hogwarts supporting me. Harry shrugged casually. So what? You seem to just put everyone else either wherever they want to go or where their parents went anyway. I know Hermione Granger seemed more suited to Ravenclaw, but she wanted Gryffindor, so that is where you put her. Draco Malfoy is, as far as I can tell, totally lacking in cunning with his only ambition to be exactly like his father, but you didn't even get all the way onto his head before you were saying Slytherin. Likely simply because he was mentally shouting that was where he wanted to go. He glanced over at Malfoy, waiting to see if he would get another wait until my father hears about this. But the boy still seemed rather pale and in shock that the mudblood he had made enemies with so quickly was Harry Potter. Harry doubted Malfoy's father would be pleased to hear that. So Harry just continued. And Gregory Goyle and Vincent Crabbe? Those two are either the craftiest buggers to ever walk the halls of Hogwarts as they hide their intelligence behind incredibly realistic masks of being stupid followers. Or, much more likely, they actually are just stupid followers and have no business being in Slytherin. For that matter, no one who is actually clever enough to warrant Slytherin would want to announce to the world how cunning they are, so the fact that anyone who actually expresses a desire to be in Slytherin actually gets and proves you just put people wherever they want to go. Though I am confused as to why anyone would want to go into a house widely believed to be filled with untrustworthy dark wizards anyway. I would think that untrustworthy dark wizards would want to go there least of all. The hat made a sound as if it was clearing its throat among the snickers and outright laughter moving through the students and the stern frowns on the faces of the professors. Well, the kind of person someone wants to be does contribute to who they will become, as does how their parents raised them. But I do have to see into your mind to make sure that the traits of your desired house do exist, or I won't put you there, no. So as I said, I cannot sort you. You will have to speak to the heads of houses and try and convince them that Gryffindor is the house for you. Harry shrugged yet again and lifted the hat off his head and handed it back to McGonagall. So when do we meet to decide my house, Professor? Harry asked the woman. She glanced up to Dumbledore with an uncertain expression, but eventually looked back at Harry and replied, Why don't you sit with Gryffindor for now, and we can meet after the feast to determine your permanent house. Harry grinned and walked over to sit between Hermione and Neville as the Gryffindors gave a hesitant and uncertain applause. You shouldn't say things like that about the sorting hat, Harry, Hermione whispered reproachfully at him. It is an ancient artifact that has been sorting for 1,000 years. Harry laughed loudly enough to draw some questioning looks and replied, Maybe it has gotten senile in all those centuries of sorting. Or more likely all those centuries of sitting on a shelf somewhere with nothing to do 364 days out of the year. He quickly cut off her objection as he continued. But I just wanted to be in the house with my friends, so I said whatever I needed to convince it. Another lie, but it was one that made Hermione end her attempts to argue as she blushed brightly and quietly muttered, Friends? As much to herself as to Harry. In actuality, he wasn't the sort that would allow what house he was in to come between him and his friends regardless, so that hadn't really been a part of his reasoning at all. Given his personality, he would probably fit within any of Slytherin, Gryffindor, or Hufflepuff. Slytherin was out for exactly the reason he had verbally given the hat. Plus the fact that the rate of Slytherin fatalities would probably eventually hover around 50% if he had to actually share a dorm with those idiots. Hufflepuff, well, honestly, loyalty was probably his most treasured trait. But he also didn't want to spend 7 years explaining to people that he only worked hard on things that mattered, and that school essays didn't. He doubted that would go over well with the Puffs. Which left Gryffindor. And he certainly had plenty of the suicidal bravery Gryffindor was known for, so he should fit best here. Besides, from what he heard, they had the best parties. But Harry didn't allow any of these thoughts to show on his face as he nodded to Hermione and smiled brightly. Yeah, of course we're friends. He then turned back to watch the rest of the sorting. A few minutes later, Ron also got sorted to Gryffindor to especially loud cheers from Harry and Ron's numerous brothers, followed by Blaise Zabini going into Slytherin to end the sorting ceremony. Dumbledore then stood up in front of the gathered students, his arms raised wide and a bright smile visible behind his impressive beard. Welcome, he said. Welcome to a new year at Hogwarts. Before we begin our banquet, I would like to say a few words. And here they are, Nitwit, Blobber, Oddment, Tweak. Thank you. He then sat back down, and huge piles of food appeared in front of them on the table. Harry honestly wasn't sure what to think. Headmaster Dumbledore seemed like a lot of fun, and the feast was fairly impressive, but there was no ramen. How could they call something a feast if there was no ramen? Harry felt like he should object, but he was fairly certain it wouldn't accomplish anything. So he was left a bit more morose than the circumstances would normally call for, but he did eat his fill and casually chatted with Hermione, Neville, and Ron. Though Ron's table manners were a little on the disgusting side, so Harry tried not to ask him questions since he consistently didn't bother to stop and swallow before he answered. Harry couldn't really object though, since his table manners had been just as poor the first time he had been 11. Though at least he had the excuse of not having parents to teach him any better. But regardless, the meal passed in comfortable chatter and good food. Though not the best food, as Harry was constantly reminded. They did have treacle tarts among the desserts though, which Harry had found to be almost as good as ramen. And the pumpkin juice tasted basically like a liquid version of pumpkin pie and was far better than it sounded. He also got the questionable treat of being horrified by Neville's family as well. Apparently they used to try and almost kill him fairly regularly to try and force his magic out. Because apparently it was better for him to be dead than not have magic in that family. Worse, the people around him were treating that as fairly ordinary. Harry would have to speak to him later in private about it. No child should have to feel worthless if they didn't have a single trait that they had no control over. That actually might be the root of much of Neville's problems, actually. And so, a meal filled with mixed reactions finally came to an end, and the remains of the desserts disappeared as Dumbledore stood once more. Ahem, just a few more words now that we are all fed and watered, Dumbledore said with his apparently standard wide smile. I have a few start-of-term notices to give you. First years should note that the forest on the grounds is forbidden to all pupils. And a few of our older students would do well to remember that as well. Dumbledore's grin and oddly twinkling eyes turned to face the Gryffindor table at those words. Specifically at the Weasley twins from what Harry could tell. They would probably be a good resource to get some tips on what sorts of interesting things could be found in this forbidden forest before he went exploring there. I have also been asked by Mr. Filch, the caretaker, to remind you all that no magic should be used between classes in the corridors. Quidditch trials will be held in the second week of the term. Anyone interested in playing for their house teams should contact Madam Hooch. And finally, I must tell you that this year, the third-floor corridor on the right-hand side is out of bounds to everyone who does not wish to die a very painful death. Harry was excited once again. Dumbledore continued on with a few more comments, and leading in the Hogwarts song, if it could be called that. But even that hideously awful thing with everyone singing to different tunes didn't significantly distract Harry. He was still focused on one thing. Hogwarts sounded much more interesting than the introduction to Magic Book had made it sound. Calling Hogwarts the safest place in Britain had made him question if he should attend. In his experience, when people said safe, what they really meant was boring. But that third-floor corridor thing sounded awesome. He would have to check that out tonight. Albus Dumbledore was not pleased. Not pleased at all. Things were not going according to plan. He had already gotten a strong indication that something had gone very wrong in his plans for Harry Potter based on Hagrid's report. But Hagrid wasn't exactly the most observant sort, so he had hoped what Hagrid had indicated was a result of the man looking for what he had hoped to see in Harry. A strong, confident, happy, and magically powerful young boy, pleased to be introduced to the magical world, both excited by many topics Hagrid also found fascinating and fully willing to accept the half-giant, as so many in the magical world were not. That shouldn't have been what Hagrid actually found. Albus had carefully examined the minds of the Dursleys before he left Harry there, not to mention Minerva's comments about them. They were petty, bigoted fools afraid of magic and bitterly jealous of anything related to Lily. Of course he hadn't wanted Harry actually abused, and he had placed several monitoring spells into the house's wards to make sure he could catch such a thing and prevent it from going too far if it had happened. But he had wanted Harry unloved. That sort of environment, where Harry grew up safe, but with no sense of family or connection to anyone who loved him beyond vague stories of his parents, it should have left him shy, withdrawn, and terribly unprepared for the life of a celebrity that was what awaited him in the magical world. It should have left him desperate for people who would love him and open to accepting the guidance of anyone who cared for him. Dumbledore had also spent 10 years subtly encouraging a sort of mythos about the boy who lived as a legendary figure with the intention that Harry would never be able to live up to it. He would be too nervous around groups of people to possibly fill the image people had of him, which would have left the students who actually interacted with him disappointed and ended with him isolated from most of his schoolmates. And at the same time, his name would have retained its rallying power among the masses of witches and wizards outside of Hogwarts, the people Harry never interacted with, to use this influence, allowing Dumbledore to use Harry's name among those people to advance the opposition against Voldemort once again when it became necessary. Instead, somehow, they got this very different version of Harry Potter. A boy far too confident with charisma beyond anything Dumbledore had seen in such a young child. He had never seen a child stride down to the Sorting Hat with hundreds of students watching and whispering with such grace in his movements and confidence in himself. Someone willing to so openly speak his beliefs to the Sorting Hat in front of the entire student body with no fear, combined with his massive magical potential, if Hagrid's report of the events of Ollivander's shop meant anything, and he might really be able to live up to his legend. Of course that wasn't automatically a bad thing. He had always meant for Harry to be a leader in the second war against Voldemort he knew was coming. But he needed to be a leader only after Albus had a chance to shape him. The dangers of someone with such magical power, and so many ready to follow him going dark, were too great. The only Hogwarts student Albus had ever seen with similar potential, both in charisma and power, had been a 15 or 16-year-old Tom Riddle. And the magical world likely wouldn't survive another like him, especially since the potential Tom Riddle had once exhibited seemed to be even greater in young Harry. And there was also the risk of the possibility of Harry being a Horcrux. Albus had long suspected the possibility. There had been the residue of dark magical energies around the room in which Voldemort lost his physical form, which very few dark rituals other than the creation of a Horcrux would match, and no object that could possibly be a Horcrux had been present. A fresh curse scar created with the energies of the most powerful dark spell in existence would have been a natural receptacle for such dark energies, though. This was further supported by the unsettling fact that Harry was a natural occlumens. Of course, no one knew exactly why some rare people came to be natural occlumens, but Harry's mind attempting to constantly defend itself against a piece of another's soul might have caused such a thing. Certainly it wasn't proof, but it was additional evidence towards a very troubling conclusion. And Harry, being a natural occlumens, was sure to be a problem as well. A natural occlumens was immune not just to legilimency, but to all forms of mental intrusion or magical manipulation. This meant that many of Albus' backup plans for Harry, should he start slipping away from the path Albus planned for the boy, would be impossible. Albus didn't use the more powerful mental spells and potions except in the most extreme of circumstances. Things like the Imperious Curse, Veritaserum, Amortentia, or similar potions for other emotions were far too obvious, not to mention rather immoral. People would immediately notice the differences in behavior. But the occasional minor loyalty potion, or one that makes someone just a little more likely to open up to someone already trusted, or just a little excessively jealous of someone, or so much more. These were where the true possibilities lay. Things so subtle no one noticed they were not their natural feelings. And after a time behaving under the influence of the potions, people would almost always continue acting in that manner even after the potions were not longer given. If someone spent months feeling loyalty towards someone and acting in that manner, the weight of inertia in their actions would almost always have them continue acting that way. Not to mention the occasional light legilimency to read Harry's thoughts and make sure the boy wasn't having any opposed to Albus' plans. Or some minor obliviation should he discover information he wasn't ready to handle. All of these would be impossible now. So between Harry's attitude and immunity to magical methods of manipulation, almost all avenues to make sure that Harry followed the path best for both the wizarding world as a whole and for Harry himself were closed. Even his tentative plans for the Mirror of Erised were completely ruined. The mirror functioned by sending out an extremely subtle legilimency probe that searched for the deepest desire buried deep within the observer's mind, which a natural occlumens would likewise be totally immune to. The Mirror of Erised was just a mirror to a natural occlumens. It would have to be something to be considered later. For now, he had a meeting with Harry and the heads of houses to see what house Harry would end up in. At least he wanted to go to Gryffindor. A Slytherin Harry Potter would have been a disaster for obvious reasons, and either Hufflepuff or Ravenclaw would have made things almost as difficult. In Hufflepuff, he would have been surrounded with friends and supporters. It would have been impossible to isolate Harry and have him truly rely upon Albus' guidance. And in Ravenclaw, Harry would have been encouraged to gather as much magical knowledge as possible, which when combined with his obvious power could possibly start him upon the same paths Tom had taken all those decades ago. But with Harry's agreement, it shouldn't be difficult to convince the other heads to allow Harry into Gryffindor. That was where everyone expected the boy who lived to go anyway. So after escorting Harry and the heads of houses to the room normally used for faculty meetings, Albus sat down and introduced the heads of the houses before giving Harry a grandfatherly smile. "So, Harry, my boy, you seem to have put us in a bit of a pickle. But you mentioned that you wanted to go into Gryffindor? Perhaps you could tell us a bit of why to help us decide if that is a good decision for you." Harry quirked an eyebrow as he looked around at Albus and the 4 other professors, spending a moment meeting Severus Glower with a confused widening of his eyes before he finally shrugged and turned back to Albus. "Well, professors, I'm sure you are already aware that my parents were both Gryffindor, which seems to be an important part of the house placement for some reason. Then just going over the traits of each of the houses I have heard from people, it just seemed that I fit with Gryffindor best. Ravenclaw I immediately disregarded. No offense, Professor," he said as he looked over to Phileas with a nod and a lopsided smile. "But I'm not really a fan of studying for its own sake. I don't mind doing the required work, or reading something occasionally if it is really interesting, but I don't like spending a lot of my free time sitting around studying." Phileas nodded graciously and replied in his squeaky voice. "Of course, Mr. Potter. Not everyone is a good fit for my house. I hope you will find the required reading and work for my class interesting, but that is all I can ask of you." Harry nodded back with a grin and continued. "Anyway, Slytherin was right out too. I'm a little too, well, blunt I guess you could say. I don't think it would work out. Plus I heard a lot of people in that house are the children of the followers of the guy who killed my parents. Allegedly." He rolled his eyes dramatically and seemed to ignore the nervous shifting of the faculty, as he continued. "I don't think we would get along." Severus took this opportunity to snort contemptuously. As if a Potter would ever have the brains or cunning to be in the house of Slytherin anyway. Harry just gave Severus a confused look once again before turning to Pomona. Right. Whatever." Which just made Severus even more annoyed as Harry ignored his barb, but Harry just continued ignoring the fuming professor. "Anyway, I thought about Hufflepuff a lot, because loyalty is important. But in the end, I thought Gryffindor would be a better fit." Harry grinned and looked around again, meeting everyone's eyes briefly except for Severus, who he continued to ignore. "I jumped off a 2-story building's roof once because my cousin bet me I wouldn't do it. It worked out pretty well too. He got in trouble with my aunt for causing me to mess up the bushes I landed on. Harry waited for the chuckles to die down. Anyway, I thought I would fit in pretty well in Gryffindor. And that's where all the friends I made on the train are too, so that is the house I would prefer. Albus nodded, still smiling gently at Harry before turning to Minerva, giving her a chance to respond. He knew she would be in favor in honor of James and Lily even if nothing else. Well, I can tell you are going to be troubled just like your father, Minerva began. But I suppose I do have the most experience dealing with such things. I think you are right that Gryffindor will be the best house for you. Do keep any troublemaking to a minimum, though. Severus snorted again, but everyone was ignoring him now. So, Albus stated happily. We are all agreed then? Harry will be in House Gryffindor? Most of the heads nodded, but Pomona obviously wasn't so quick to give up. Well, Mr. Potter said loyalty was also very important to him. And one of his reasons for wanting to be in Gryffindor is to be in the house with the friends he made on the train. That is obviously a very Hufflepuff attitude. She then turned to address Harry directly. And I promise you will be able to find many new friends easily within Hufflepuff, as well as maintain friendships with any Gryffindors you wish. Hufflepuff and Gryffindor have always gotten along rather well. Albus had to force himself not to sigh. Of course Pomona would be the one to object. Minerva would take his lead, Severus would rather cut off his own arm than accept a Potter into his house, and Phileas was intelligent enough to accept that Harry didn't belong in Ravenclaw. But Pomona would truly wish Harry to go to the house she believed he would be happiest in. And she could be quite stubborn at times. She tended to focus far too much on the individual happiness of her students rather than what was best for the wizarding world. It was most frustrating at times. And there was likely a bit of a desire to have the boy who lived bring prestige to the least respected of the houses as well. Of course, she would never understand just how important that lack of respect was. Groups that saw themselves as oppressed, even if just in minor or subtle ways, always looked for an influential leader to support them. And as the leader of the Light, he was the natural choice for the almost universally light Hufflepuffs. The Hufflepuffs which, with their hard-working mentality, formed the backbone of both the ministry and the wizarding economy. True, it was often not in the more visible positions of leadership, but Hufflepuff support had, in many ways, helped him push the wizarding world in the right direction to an even greater extent than the Gryffindors. That wasn't exactly something he could explain to Pomona as yet another reason Harry needed to go to Gryffindor though. So instead, he smiled gently at the woman and replied, Yes, indeed. Harry does seem to possess both traits of Hufflepuff and Gryffindor most strongly. A powerful combination, to be sure. But as the Sorting Hat suggested, our choices of what sort of person we want to be do have a powerful influence on who we will become. When the traits of two houses are equal, it is our choices which define us. Albus looked around among the other staff members for a moment before meeting Harry's gaze with a gentle smile as he continued. I think that James and Lily Potter would be quite proud to see their child enter into Gryffindor. A proud and brave lion who yet remembers the importance of friendship, loyalty, and hard work. Of course, bringing out the topic of James and Lily was a bit underhanded. Who could deny the wish of the people who had died to defend their child? The fact that giving an orphan, no matter how confident or self-assured, the idea that their parents would be proud of him would have Harry looking to Albus to provide guidance of what else he could do to make them proud was certainly an additional benefit. But eventually the other heads gave nods of agreement, and even Pomona gave a reluctant nod, though she quickly made one last comment to Harry. Well, if you are sure, Mr. Potter, I know that Hufflepuff would certainly welcome you, and that you could do very well in my house, but if you are determined to go to Gryffindor, I will not stand in your way. Albus waited for Harry to give his silent but firm nod before stating, Very well. As the headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, with the support of the heads of each of the 4 houses, I declare Harry Potter to be officially sorted into Gryffindor House. So mote it be. He then watched with a satisfied smile as the edges of Harry's robes changed to Gryffindor colors and the Gryffindor crest appeared over Harry's chest. And perhaps helping Harry get into his desired house would create the beginning of the trust Albus needed Harry to have in him over the coming years. All for something Albus wanted anyway. It was always best when things worked out that way. All right. Why don't you take Harry to his dorm, Minerva? And the rest of you can see to your students as well. I'm sorry for keeping you. Oh, but Severus. If you could stay for just a moment, I would appreciate it. After the others filed out, a still scowling Severus Snape was left alone in the room with Albus. So, did you get anything at all? Albus asked quietly. No. Severus snarled back. His defenses are like a wall, solid beyond anything I have ever seen before. Though from what I have read, natural acclimans are supposed to have minds that are just impossible to find at all. As if they don't have minds at all, they are so well hidden. Not like this infinite barrier in Potter's mind. Albus nodded thoughtfully. Of course, he had tried a gentle surface legitimacy scan as well, but because of the more antagonistic relationship which Severus could afford to create with Harry, Severus could be more direct about it. If Harry felt anything strange from Severus, he would attribute it to the strange glares the man was giving rather than an attempt at magically intruding into his mind. Yes, that was the indication I have gotten, but there haven't really been enough natural accliments through Hogwarts to know if they are all the same. There is no way he could have had a chance to study the art in the Muggle world. And those defenses, whatever they are far beyond anything I have ever seen before. Far beyond what you or even I could hope to accomplish. A natural acclimens is the only explanation. And it wasn't like there were a lot of natural acclimens who developed the ability because their mind was constantly subconsciously fending off attacks from an implanted Horcrux, so it wasn't unlikely there would be some differences. Severus snorted in derision. Again. Sometimes Albus had to wonder if all that snorting was bad for Severus' sinuses. The boy is just like his father. He is going to be a nightmare. Already causing problems on the first night. Now Severus, Albus replied in a placating tone. He doesn't even really look that much like his father. His hair is much shorter and he doesn't wear glasses. Honestly, he looks much more like his mother with those eyes and his cheekbones. And clearly this wasn't his fault. He can't help that he happens to be a natural acclimens, as inconvenient as that might be. Severus frowned severely. He is nothing like her. Did you see the way he was arrogantly strutting around? Showing off his scar like he was proud of the reminder of his parents' death? Arguing with a centuries-old sorting hat as if he knows better. He outright told his teachers he isn't going to study, for Merlin's sake. He's going to be a menace just like his father, I guarantee it. Albus just sighed in resignation. There wasn't any point in arguing with Severus on this topic. Although his unthinking antagonism towards Harry would likely be useful from time to time, it was frustrating discussing it with the normally very logical man. On this one topic, Severus was incapable of being rational and unbiased in any way. Which made him predictable, but sometimes he would prefer if Severus could just set aside his ridiculous prejudice and act towards the greater good regardless of his own feelings. All right, Severus, you can go tend to your new Slytherins, Albus said as he waved his hand vaguely in the direction of the door to the room as he began to spend a few more moments in thought about the latest information on Harry. Unfortunately, these moments of introspection were rather quickly put to an end. Severus had risen from his seat and attempted to stomp off, as was usual for him when he was in one of his snits, but rather quickly ended lying on the floor instead. What in Merlin's name? Severus exclaimed as he lifted himself from his sprawled position to look down at his feet. My shoelaces are tied together. These shoes don't even have shoelaces. But his tone of shock and amazement quickly turned to fury as he looked up at Albus. Potter did this. The potions professor growled so harshly his words were barely even perceptible. He lifted himself up to a sitting position on the floor and pulled out his wand to send a savage severing charm to cut the tied-together shoelaces with enough force to scar the stone floor between his feet. And now that Albus had a chance to look at them, he agreed that it was clear they did not originally come with the shoes, though in his opinion they gave the shoes a very interesting look in spite of the lack of actual need for shoelaces. Perhaps he could get some like that. You see what I told you? Severus continued in his angry diatribe, too quickly for Albus to get his own words in as the man carefully clambered back to his feet. Only the first night in Hogwarts, and already he is at it. This is just the beginning, Albus. You need to rein him in now or I will do it for you. Albus nearly groaned. He didn't need this additional aggravation, so he tried to say as soothingly as possible. Now, Severus. You know as well as I do that there is no possible way Harry could be responsible for this. He was in front of us for the entire time he was in the room and never even drew his wand. The boy doesn't even know any magic yet anyway. I'm sure it is simply a case of the Weasley twins finding out how to delay the onset of a spell over the summer and wanting to try it out as soon as possible. You know how they are. Albus chuckled with amusement as he thought back on their frequent antics and pulled out his own wand to cast a silent finite on the shoes to restore them to their original shoestringless state, only to rock back in his chair in shock as nothing changed. Now that is interesting, he said quietly as he examined the shoes more closely. In fact, it looked like the apparently very real shoelaces had somehow forced small holes through the leather of Severus' shoes as they laced themselves before tying together between the two shoes. An interesting bit of animation spellwork, whoever had performed it. It was Potter. I know that it was, Severus predictably responded. I don't know how, but I know that it was him. You can't just let him get away with this. Now, Severus, Albus responded, audibly sighing this time. It can have been Harry. I'm sure the entire faculty will do their best to try and determine who the culprit was, but you cannot just assume everything is Harry's fault without any reason. Harry walked along beside McGonagall, looking around at all of the paintings and suits of armor lining the walls as he thought back to his little prank on Professor Snape. It was pretty minor and rather simplistic for him, but sometimes that type of prank was a lot of fun too. Though he did prefer to see the reaction to his pranks, but this had been just a spur-of-the-moment thing as he saw Snape glowering at him for no reason and insulting him, apparently simply for being a Potter. Perhaps the Snapes and the Potters had some sort of ancient blood feud. Wizarding society seemed archaic enough for that sort of thing to be relatively common, so it seemed likely, given how Snape had been treating his last name as a curse. That would likely make potions classes a little awkward. Fortunately, Harry didn't really care about his grades. And if Snape wanted to restart some feud Harry had never even heard of, well, that sounded like a perfectly valid source of entertainment to him. If Snape continued his glares and undeserved insults, Harry could always escalate to more intricate and interesting pranks from there. Honestly, if the man had any intelligence at all, he would realize that anyone who could successfully create even so simplistic a prank with only moments' notice directly in front of the senior staff wasn't someone it was a good idea to annoy without cause. For some reason, he doubted it. He had to repress his grin though. He was sure word of what had happened would make its way to McGonagall quickly enough, so it would be best if she didn't remember him having a strange mischievous grin walking away from the meeting. Eventually, after a fairly lengthy walk mostly in silence, with the occasional comment about Hogwarts or Hogwarts rules, Professor McGonagall stopped, motioning to the painting of a rather large woman as she explained. "This is the entrance to Gryffindor Tower. It will be your home 10 months of the year for the next 7 years. To enter, you must give the fat lady a password, which will be changed regularly." As Professor McGonagall paused at this point, Harry quickly interrupted with a confused look. "Wait, why is there a password? As I understand it, the paintings are aware and have memory. Why can't they just remember who is in Gryffindor and allow us in? A password could easily be overheard by someone from another house." McGonagall looked a little surprised, but also with an edge of disapproval in her expression. "A password is traditional." Harry rolled his eyes, though he didn't say anything. There had to have been a reason to start the tradition, so that answer was ultimately just avoiding of the question. Probably because she didn't know the answer. Teachers never liked appearing ignorant in front of their students. Though perhaps the eye roll wasn't a good idea, because McGonagall's expression changed from slightly disapproving to an outright frown as she continued harshly. "The current password is Caput Draconis. Remember it." Once the password was given, the painting nodded regally at Professor McGonagall and swung open to reveal the Gryffindor common room. Apparently those inside the common room had been waiting for them too, because it took less than a second for the Gryffindors to see Harry through the opening entrance and begin cheering. The Weasley twins even began a chant of, "We got Harry," which was picked up by a significant portion of the rest of the crowd in the common room, though many were content with just cheering loudly. Harry just grinned and strode into the room, waving around at everyone good-naturedly. He was still a little unhappy with being famous for something he was relatively certain his mother had been responsible for, but he was pretty used to being famous, and fame was a lot better than what he had expected coming into the wizarding world. So he might as well make use of it until he had a chance to become famous for his own actions. It took a couple minutes for the cheering to die down, but when it finally did, Harry yelled out, "Thank you everyone for your great welcome. I am proud to say that I was able to convince the headmaster and the heads of the houses to put me into the best house at Hogwarts." Of course this drew further cheers. There wasn't anything wrong with some occasional pandering though. McGonagall just shook her head, though she looked to be repressing a bit of a smile now, which was certainly an improvement. Once things died down, she looked around with one of her stern gazes and said, "All right. That's enough of that. It's about time all of you went off to bed. Classes start tomorrow." She turned to Harry as she continued, "I'm sure someone can show you to your dorm, Mr. Potter. I will see you in the morning to hand out schedules." With that she gave him a smile, if a brief one, and turned to walk out of the still open entryway to the tower. Harry just waited for the door to close, then turned back to the crowds with a grin and said, "Well, from what I hear, one of the things that makes Gryffindor the best house is that Gryffindors throw the best parties." This brought more cheers and a great deal of laughter, though Harry did notice Hermione off in one corner frowning rather harshly at that comment. But eventually one of the Weasley twins came forward and slapped Harry on the back while the other dragged out a keg of what the other twin explained was butterbeer. It looked to be the beginning of a very long night. McGonagall was probably not going to be pleased come morning. Chapter 9, A Big Dog. Fred Weasley glanced around the Gryffindor common room with amusement. Most of the students had slowly wandered off for their beds over the course of the Welcome Back to Hogwarts / Harry Potter is in Gryffindor party. But there were a few of the older students who apparently preferred drinking themselves into a stupor and passing out wherever they lay at the time. It had been a little concerning at first, This was the first year that Fred and his brother had been able to sneak various alcoholic drinks and other necessary party treats into the castle. And although them being the ones supplying most of the party supplies provided all kinds of opportunities for pranks, it also worked through their supplies with alarming rate. However, just as they began to worry at just how much some of the 6th and 7th years were drinking and how totally they were willing to ignore the minor prank effects that came with it, Harry Potter himself had come to the rescue. Everyone knew that the Potters had plenty of money, but it had been very nice of him to offer to provide whatever money was needed for future party supplies as long as they would be the ones to actually obtain them. For that matter, Harry seemed a nice bloke all around. Of course, he had the supreme self-confidence in his movements and words one would expect from the savior of the wizarding world, but he didn't seem arrogant about it like Fred had feared. He hadn't looked down on any of them as lesser beings or expected them to serve him, or anything like that. He had only known Harry for a few hours so far, so he might not have the full picture, but so far the kid had seemed a pretty down-to-earth friendly person, and he certainly enjoyed a good laugh. In a couple years, Fred might see if George wanted to try and induct young Harry into the noble art of pranking. He clearly already had a decent sense of humor, and had even helped defuse a few situations from those who didn't appreciate having their hair or skin change colors or being forced to dance a jig. It wasn't like they had pulled out any of the really serious stuff. Those sorts of pranks were strictly reserved for Slytherins. But some people just couldn't take a joke. Potter didn't have a problem with that though. He had actually seemed to have a way of convincing the victims of a prank to laugh along with others, rather than get upset about being laughed at. A much better result all around. Harry did seem to have an uncanny ability to avoid himself being the target of their pranks though, which was a good sign in a budding prankster. Someone who could recognize a prank coming was someone who could plan one himself. The first time had been when he had avoided a prank pastry they had sent his way. It might have just been coincidence, or him not liking that kind of pastry if that was the only incident of its kind. At the time, they hadn't thought anything of it. Then he had casually dodged a jinx sent at his back and given a playful wink at them for the attempt. That had been impressive, but really nothing that shouldn't have been expected of the boy who lived. But the third, that one was the one that confused Fred. They had seen him drink a cup they knew was potioned, with absolutely no effect. And the kid had just laughed at them when they gave up trying to figure out how he did it, and asked him. Yes, the boy definitely had potential. But for now Fred nudged George awake. The last conscious person in the common room had finally dozed off, or passed out, depending on how polite you were being about it. The two of them had tried a little fire whiskey, but had mostly stuck with butterbeer. Being sober enough to successfully complete pranks was far more interesting than drinking until they fell over. Besides, it was the perfect time to do an initial investigation of that third-floor corridor. They could be the first to see what Dumbledore was hiding. And the party made a pretty good alibi too. If they were asked about it later, there were a dozen people who could attest that they were passed out in the common room. After all, Fred had learned long ago that a lie that made the liar look bad was far more likely to be believed. That was true for everyone, but it was especially true when concerning the Weasley twins, given the fact that every adult who knew them would keep digging until they came up with some sort of wrongdoing. Start with the drinking, and people wouldn't look any further. "Come on, George," Fred whispered to his brother, as he headed towards the exit from the Gryffindor common room. As he walked, he carefully slipped out of a pocket in his robes what looked like a blank piece of parchment until he whispered the words. "I solemnly swear that I am up to no good," as he tapped it with his wand. The Marauder's map, as the parchment was revealed to be, was truly a marvel, for it revealed a detailed map of the entire Hogwarts castle as well as the movements of everyone who resided there. Fred and George still had no idea how it worked, but were determined to figure it out by the time they graduated. A quick glance at the map revealed no movement in the hallways, so Fred gave a small nod to his brother as George approached and slipped out of the now open doorway with him, putting the map away once more at the same time. The hallways of Hogwarts were deserted, but that was to be expected after 2 o'clock in the morning. From prior years' experience, Fred knew that Filch would occasionally patrol this late, but all the prefects and other teachers would be long asleep in their beds. On the other hand, while the chances of getting caught were reduced, the penalties tended to be much higher as well. Being out less than an hour after curfew tended to result in a detention and a few points lost. But being out this late would have McGonagall coming down hard even if she didn't know what they were up to. Which was why the two brothers remained silent as they crept through the hallways towards the forbidden third-floor corridor. Though why the third floor, Fred would never know. There were entire wings of Hogwarts that were almost never used, but the third-floor corridor which Dumbledore had so temptingly forbidden this year was the standard location for the defense against the dark arts classroom. Every student from second year up knew their way around that corridor quite well. As they approached the entrance to the third floor, Fred whispered to his brother. "Stop for a minute. Let me check the map to make sure no one is up." He then pulled out the map again, activated it, and glanced at it briefly. He didn't expect anyone this late, and was just scanning the hallways nearby for any movement, so he almost missed it. But just as he was about to clear and close the map, he noticed another name where there should have just been two. In a clump in the middle of an abandoned hall just short of the door leading to the third-floor corridor were three names. It took a few seconds for that to really process, as he just stared at the extra name which according to the map was less than a dozen feet from him and his brother. But finally what that name meant worked its way through the impossibility of it being there in his mind, and he spun around and called out, "Harry Potter?" to the shock of his brother. But his brother was even more shocked when a rather sheepish-looking Harry Potter stepped out from behind a set of armor the twins had walked past less than 30 seconds before. Hey guys. How are you doing tonight?" Harry asked with what might have been a charming grin to anyone else. But Fred had attempted that exact grin too many times to fall for it himself. "Hi Harry," Fred began, and George picked up. "Just out for a walk." "How about you?" Fred finished. Many people thought that either they planned out these conversations or had some kind of magical twin mental link, or something ridiculous like that. Neither was true. Really, it was just a combination of knowing each other really well and being very, very good at improvisation. They knew each other well enough to generally guess the basic direction of the other's thoughts and ideas. And when one of them guessed wrong about where the other was going with something, which did happen occasionally, they were good enough to just roll with the change and continue the conversation as if it was always planned to go that way. "Oh," Harry responded with a surprised expression on his face. "I was going to go look at the third-floor corridor Dumbledore told us to stay away from. It sounded interesting. I assumed you guys were going there too when you left the common room." The cheeky little bugger then gave a casual shrug and started towards the doorway they were standing in front of as he said, "Oh well. Have a nice walk. Guess I will see you in the morning?" "Wait," Fred said, finding himself shocked once again. "You followed us all the way from the common room? I thought you were just hiding there," he said with a vague hand motion towards the suit of armor the first year had been behind when Fred noticed him on the map. That would have been at least vaguely possible. Fred thought he would have noticed Harry as they passed the set of armor, but it was possible they might have missed him. But surely they would have noticed him if he was following them all the way from the common room. But Harry just shrugged noncommittally before asking, "So how did you know where I was? Something about a map? You clearly didn't see me until whatever that is told you I was there." "Oh that." Fred glanced over at George with a concerned look. "That's well." He trailed off and George finished somewhat lamely. "A secret." Normally they were so careful to keep the map hidden from anyone else, only checking it when they were certain no one was watching or listening to them. That hadn't worked out so well for them this time though. Caught by a first year, on the very first night of school. Fred was sure he would die of shame. Or possibly that was just gas. Maybe George could tell him which it was later. Harry quirked an eyebrow questioningly, but he also shrugged and replied, "Okay, I guess. Anyway, we were going to see what made Dumbledore forbid this corridor, right?" Fred glanced over to his twin once again, and found him wearing a matching wide grin as they both looked back at Harry. "So, Ickle Harrikins wants to go exploring with us?" George continued, shifting back into territory more comfortable for the twins. They then advanced on the little first year with wide grins any of the older Hogwarts students would have found quite ominous, as they continued shifting back and forth and who spoke. "Discover secrets? Find danger? Unravel mysteries? Evade capture? Be a distraction? Act as bait?" George finished the steadily increasingly menacing questions, now having advanced close enough to loom over the younger boy. It did not have the intended effect, as Harry simply grinned back at the two and replied in a voice that simply could not be any more bright and chipper. "Sure. That sounds like fun." Fred just looked over at his twin with a slightly confused raised eyebrow, meeting George's identical expression before they simultaneously fell in on both sides of Harry and dropped their arms around the shorter boy's shoulders. "Very well then, my good chum," George began. "Onwards we go, into the unknown. And may you still be alive on the morrow. Or at least not implicate us in your demise." Fred ended in a tone almost as cheerful as the one Harry used moments before. But Harry just continued to grin back at both of them, clearly not intimidated in the slightest. Which made for what would have been a rather odd sight if anyone had been there to witness it, as three widely grinning children hurried into the dark and abandoned third-floor corridor late at night with arms wrapped around each other's shoulders. Having arrived at their destination, none spoke, and they simply looked around for whatever secrets Dumbledore might be hiding here. Not that they could be truly serious secrets, given that telling an entire school to stay away was almost begging said school children to investigate. But the corridor seemed simply abandoned. Fred knew it well from going to defense against the dark arts for 2 years, so he assumed he would have noticed anything significantly out of place. But all he saw was an empty hallway and a few dusty rooms. Or that is all he saw until they reached the closed doorway at the end of the corridor. Both Fred and George paused at this point to examine the doorway, carefully looking around for any signs of traps or any sort of monitoring. But before they could make more than the most cursory examination, Harry slipped out of the grasp and darted up to the doorway to yank on the handle, totally ignoring their simultaneously harshly whispered, "No, wait!" But fortunately the door didn't budge. Not that this changed Fred's annoyance. There was a certain way in which these things were done. The twins had plenty of experience from similar explorations in the past. There was a reason Dumbledore looked at 2/3 years when he explained about the Forbidden Forest being forbidden. And jumping forward to yank open closed doors in forbidden areas wasn't the way to do it. After all, there was also a reason they were still alive after taking so many trips into the Forbidden Forest as first and second years that even Dumbledore was aware of it. And caution was especially important when Dumbledore said that certain death awaited those who ventured here. Not even the Forbidden Forest got such a strong advertisement, and there were all kinds of ways to get yourself killed very quickly there if you were not careful. This was clearly something Harry had no understanding of, because by the time the twins had taken slow sighs of relief at Harry's failure to open the door, the boy had pulled out his wand from somewhere. It must have been one of those fancy quick-release wrist holsters because the wand seemed to just appear in his hand. But still, without listening to their earlier urges for Harry to wait, he jammed the wand directly into the keyhole and twisting it, causing a quiet click which was rather ominous for all its almost inaudible nature. This time Fred's exclamation of, "Wait, stop!" was not in a whisper. George was still a bit too shocked to say anything, but he did jump forward with Fred to grab Harry before he could pull the door open. Unfortunately, they pulled Harry directly away from the door. The door which Harry was still holding the handle of. A door which opened out into the hall in the direction they were pulling Harry. When the door swung open rather forcefully, given the strength of the twins' combined pull, both froze. This was a very, very different situation than their normal careful and guarded exploration of the unknown. But while they were staring into pitch black of the room beyond the now open doorway, Harry took advantage of their shock to slip away from their loosened grasp and hurry through the doorway. They both probably would have found the desperately quiet screams for Harry to come back quite humorous in other circumstances. But in these circumstances they were far more concerned with the fact that the floating blue ball of light Harry had produced somehow was showed a massive three-headed dog very much awake and aware of their presence, and not pleased with it, if its low growling meant anything. But as much as their own senses of terror had already spiked in this new and unexpected situation, they quickly found that things could still get worse when Harry's response to this new sight consisted of an exclamation of, "Cool! Look at that!" and taking a step forward. And then the growling, which had been growing steadily louder as Harry moved towards the great beast, abruptly cut off with startling suddenness, replaced with a soft whimper. All either of the twins could see was that Harry was just looking at the giant dog, so this unexpected change was just as strange to them as Harry's apparent insanity. But even that shock was beaten when Harry finally reached the Cerberus and stretched up to scratch it behind the ear of its middle head. More importantly, this meant that the dog's giant muzzle, large enough to literally bite an 11-year-old in half, was pressed against his chest, and the right head was looking directly at his unprotected back. And yet it didn't attack. As Harry continued to scratch, he murmured, "Ah, you're a good boy, aren't you? Yes, you are. Such a good doggy," in the exact tone generally reserved for 6-inch tall puppies, rather than 8-foot tall monsters. But instead of doing what would make sense in a rational world and immediately killing and eating Harry, its tail started wagging quite vigorously as its body loomed over the comparatively tiny Harry Potter. This was finally enough to shake the twins out of the state of astonished horror which had virtually consumed them for the past minute. So Fred turned to George and quietly whispered, "Am I dreaming, George?" "Well, I don't think you are dreaming," he responded just as quietly. "But I might be. What do you think?" Fred shrugged in reply. "I don't think you are dreaming either if I'm not. This is weird though, right? I haven't suddenly gone insane or anything?" "Well," George hesitated. "No more insane than normal, I suppose. Do you think it is just tame? Maybe just looks scary, but is actually very friendly?" "It's a Cerberus. I remember hearing about those from Charlie. They are not supposed to really be tameable. They make good guard dogs in that they will tear anyone who comes close apart, but no one really uses them because that anyone includes the person who put the Cerberus there. They are only supposed to respect and leave alone things bigger and stronger than them. So, dragons and the like, I suppose?" Fred cocked his head to the side and squinted, trying to remember everything Charlie had mentioned about them. "But maybe someone figured out how to control them. Think we should check it out? After a short hesitation, George said. Sure, old brother of mine. You first. Oh, I couldn't possibly. I'm the pretty one. No, that was me, remember? Ah, right you are. But still Fred hesitated, not quite willing to take those steps which would put him within range of those massive, flesh-rending jaws, regardless of how docile it seemed. But his hesitation was interrupted as Harry turned back at him, not stopping his scratching as he did so, and called out. Are you guys putting on that show for me, or are you really like that one by yourselves? He sounded honestly curious, and not at all concerned by the fact that he was now not looking at any of the three massive heads which could decide to tear him to pieces at a moment's notice. This was enough to reassure Fred, so he took a deep breath and started walking forward as he said, I have no idea what you are talking about, Harrikins. That's a scary thought, Harry replied dryly. George just snorted. That's the thing you find scary? Harry blinked in surprise and frowned in a confused manner. What else would I be scared of? After a short pause, the Cerberus butted his head into Harry's chest, knocking him back a couple steps, apparently wanting him to move his scratching to a different area. This did seem to remind Harry that a veritable machine of death was literally rubbing against him at this particular moment, though. So his eyes widened as he continued. Oh, you mean him? Nah, he's a good doggy. At this, he turned back to the beast and started scratching more enthusiastically once again. The change came very quickly. At least as fast as when the Cerberus had originally switched from growling threateningly to whimpering subserviently. One moment the middle head was panting in satisfaction at the thorough ear rub he was receiving, and the other two heads were just looking on with mild curiosity, and ignoring the two red-headed twins. The next moment, the left head apparently decided to make a meal out of Fred and lunged forward with shocking speed. It was so fast, in fact, that Fred couldn't even do anything other than freeze in terror. Harry, though, moved with what had to be at least equal speed. Fred wasn't actually watching him at that particular moment, though, given that a gaping maw was rushing towards him, and that took most of his attention. But the moment before the Cerberus' teeth reached him, Harry appeared just in front of him and reached into the monster's mouth to grab hold of one of its canines. And despite the fact that his hand didn't even reach all the way around the tooth, he used that as a handhold to twist the head to the side and into the ground hard enough to shake the floor slightly. And with that, the other two heads of the Cerberus dropped down to the ground, and all three began to whine piteously as Harry started scolding the creature like a puppy who made a mess in the living room. Bad doggy! Bad! He isn't food. You shouldn't try to eat him. That's bad. Fred used this time to scurry back to his brother outside the room and well out of the range of any of the heads, should they decide to try and make a snack of him once again. After another 30 seconds of scolding and of the twins looking on in awe, Harry let the left head up and started softly scratching it under its jaw as he looked back at the twins. Sorry about that. He seems to think you are food for some reason. You probably shouldn't come here again without me in the future. Sometimes it takes a few times for puppies to learn, and that wouldn't really be good. Yeah? That wouldn't be good at all. I don't think we will be coming back here at all, though, after tonight, George stated slowly. Fred was still in too much shock to say anything. Harry shrugged and gave a pat to the head he had been scratching before pushing it back away from him as he walked out the door and pushed it closed again. Well, that works too, I guess. Anyway, thanks for letting me come with you to check out the third-floor corridor. It was pretty exciting. You will have to show me all the good spots in the Forbidden Forest sometime. Right. Maybe sometime, Fred finally responded, his tremors subsiding to manageable levels. Okay. Well, I'm going to go explore the castle some more tonight. I will see you guys in the morning, I guess? Yeah, sure. Just watch out for Filch and Mrs. Norris, George replied a little uncertainly. She can be, kind of, mean. Okay, I'll keep an eye out for them. Thanks for the warning, Harry called out over his shoulder as he walked away, leaving the two twins in a rare state of speechlessness standing alone in the third-floor forbidden corridor. A long silence passed before Fred finally broke in. So that was... He trailed off, not quite sure of how to describe the long series of insane events which had just taken place. But George seemed to understand, as he replied, Yes, it definitely was. Very much so. Another silence followed, though not quite as long. So, Fred asked, ready to head back, I suppose? He quickly pulled out the Marauder's map while he asked the question to glance around for any movement, finding none except for the mark that indicated Harry Potter had already made it up to the 5th floor. A few minutes later, as they walked through the darkened but familiar hallways of Hogwarts, George slowly asked, So, do you suppose that all those ridiculous Harry Potter stories might be true after all? You mean the ones in which Harry kills a rampaging werewolf at 4, slays an entire coven of vampires at 6, and tames a wild dragon to serve as his mount at 7? Fred took a moment to consider it. That does seem a little too close to what happened tonight for comfort. Dad said they weren't real though, but I guess it's possible he was wrong. Another moment passed in silent contemplation before George started snickering. What? Asked Fred. Ginny is going to be so mad that we got to be part of a Harry Potter adventure, and she didn't. Fred started snickering at this thought too. So what do you think the best way to gloat would be? Should we start sending letters now, or should we wait until we are in person at Christmas to let her know what she missed? Oh, that's just mean, Fred. George cocked his head to the side in thought. But we should definitely start hinting at it in letters now. Let the anticipation of the full story build up over the months. I think that would have the biggest impact. She'll go mental. And Mom might end up a little barmy too, having to put up with her complaints over not being here. So 2 for the price of 1, huh? Fred laughed again, the world returning to normal as he bantered and plotted with his brother. Or perhaps the sense of normalcy had more to do with the fact that Harry Potter wasn't around anymore. Eventually the laughter died down and Fred said, "Should be a fun few months. And there is always next year if she is really determined to be part of her own Harry Potter adventure. Assuming she can ever work up the courage to speak to him anyway." Chapter 10, First Classes. The morning seemed to come especially early for Harry. It was possible that might have been at least partially because he didn't go to bed until after 4 in the morning. But Harry could operate on 3 hours of sleep for quite a while before it really started to negatively impact him. For that matter, he could go about a week with no sleep at all without any significant loss of focus, though it started getting pretty annoying after a while. Still, chakra really was a wonderful thing, especially when you had it in truly enormous quantities. And anyone who said that the ability to breathe fire or move at superhuman speeds were the best part of being able to use chakra never had a chance to laugh at their barely conscious roommates, as they stumbled into doors after only receiving those few hours of sleep without the benefits of chakra. Ron in particular didn't seem very appreciative of his amusement though. But Harry didn't let that bother him, so he just waved over his shoulder and called out, "I'll see you guys in the Great Hall," as he hurried down the stairs into the common room. The Gryffindor common room was still pretty messy from the prior night, but most of the current occupants were ignoring that. The majority of them were older students he had met in passing during the party, and they were generally gathering in small groups before heading out of the common room, presumably for breakfast. The only exception was also the only other first year already down in the common room. Hermione Granger seemed to be spending her morning alternating between reading the rather thick tome on her lap and looking around with obvious disapproval at the signs of the previous night's successes, which she had gone to bed far too early to have been a part of. "Hey Hermione," Harry said with a smile and a small wave as he headed in her direction. Of course this just focused her obvious ire on him, rather than the mess that had been left in the common room. "Harry!" she exclaimed. "You really shouldn't have encouraged them to throw a party like that. According to Hogwarts, a history, it was against all kinds of school rules, and I think a few laws too. And if that wasn't bad enough, it was the night before the first day of class. Now people are going to have to go to their first classes of the year exhausted or even hungover." She whispered harshly with an accompanying glare at one student a few years older than them who was clearly wincing at the light in the common room. Not that the boy paid any attention to the glare, or even noticed it for that matter. He clearly had other things to concern himself with. And if he had been paying attention, he probably would have, like Harry, focused more on Hermione's feat of giving that entire tirade without taking a breath rather than any ineffectual scolding. Hermione just continued with her little rant though. "We should have been reading through the first few chapters of our books again, or at least sleeping to make sure we are well rested for class. Not staying up unreasonably late and partying." She said the word with an impressive amount of scorn for an 11-year-old. So much so that Harry was barely able to catch himself from bursting into laughter. That probably wouldn't have gone over well. Instead, he just shook his head and waved for Hermione to follow him. "Come on Hermione, let's go to breakfast. We can talk on the way." "Oh." Her eyes widened and she seemed frozen in surprise at the invitation for a moment before she pulled herself together and flushed slightly as she quickly stuffed her book into her bag and stood. "Okay, Harry," she answered in a softer tone. They were silent for the few moments it took to walk out of the common room through the portrait entrance. And it wasn't one of those comfortable silences either. Actually, it was pretty awkward. Harry just ignored that and started talking once they were walking through the hallways. "Hermione, first of all, as I understand it, there is a potion to cure any hangover anyone might have. And there is even one to give energy if someone is really so exhausted they can't focus. So any students really suffering can just go to this school nurse? I guess?" He gave a casual shrug and continued. "Well anyway, they can get fixed up in just a couple minutes. Besides, even if that wasn't true, this is just the first day of classes. While I haven't ever been to a magical class before, I refuse to believe that there is enough difference between magicals and muggles that the first classes of the year will be all that different. You know, all they will do is hand out the syllabus and discuss what we will be learning this year. Maybe they will demonstrate a little of the magic we will be learning, and at best students will review what they have forgotten over the summer. So it really doesn't matter much if we are not quite at 100% this morning. Hermione looked horrified at the implication that what they were learning today might not be critical information requiring all of their focus to master. But she rallied herself and responded. That's not the point. The professors should have our full attention regardless of exactly what they are teaching. And even if their condition can be fixed with magic, they really shouldn't be bothering the Mediwitch with the problems they brought on themselves. And more importantly, she continued, that doesn't change the fact that you were breaking the rules. Why, you could have all received detention on the very first night. Before classes even started. Harry just gave a shrug which virtually radiated his total lack of concern. Yeah, possibly. That is our choice to take that risk though. I can't imagine that any student at the party last night didn't understand that we would probably get in some trouble in the unlikely event of Professor McGonagall deciding to drop in on us at 1 in the morning. But each of us decided that having some fun and meeting some new people was worth that risk. And also worth being tired and possibly hungover in the morning. No one other than possibly ourselves were hurt, so that was our choice to make. Besides, there wasn't even enough alcohol there for anyone to drink enough to get dangerously drunk even if they wanted to. Not even with the pretty low alcohol tolerances of a bunch of teenagers. Hermione opened her mouth to respond, probably angrily if her expression was anything to go by, but Harry quickly continued before she got a chance. Look, you are clearly someone who cares a great deal about following all of the rules whenever possible. At her hurt expression, he quickly continued to reassure her. And there isn't anything wrong with that. Really, there isn't, though some people will probably tell you there is. The world needs people like you at least as much as it needs people like me who have a certain casual disregard for the rules when necessary. He gave a thoughtful expression and tacked on. Or entertaining. That last comment didn't seem to reassure the girl, so he hurried on with. Even Gryffindor, which seems to largely share that attitude of seeing the rules as more of a general guideline than a hard and fast line not to be crossed. But if you want to follow the rules, that should be your business. Other people should be allowed to make their own choices as long as they are not hurting anyone. Hermione was clearly now thinking about what he said now, rather than just reacting in anger, but it was just as clear from her frown that she still didn't like it or approve. But the rules are there for a reason. Someone didn't just randomly come along and decide how things should be just because they felt like making the students unhappy. The rules are there for our own good. So they should be followed by everyone, not just those who happen to agree with them. Harry nodded, which made Hermione start to smile, but then he said, well, it's a good point, but not really realistic. First, because not all rules are really for our own good. Frequently the people who created the rules didn't think through all the implications. Or sometimes they were even purposefully malicious in creating them. Cutting off Hermione's objection before it could begin, he once again continued. People who create rules are people too. People with their own goals. Sometimes those goals are for everyone's best interest, and sometimes they are just for their own best interest. Anyway, even if that isn't the case, rules tend to be overgeneralizations about what people need that don't really apply to all people or in all situations. For example, the particular rules in question from last night's little gathering. For many people, yeah, it probably would have been better for them to get a few more hours of sleep and not drink so much. For me though, I don't need as much sleep as most people, and as far as I can tell, it is literally impossible for me to drink enough to become intoxicated. Probably just something weird about my magic, but my point is that the reasons behind the rule not to stay up late drinking just don't apply in my case. Even if that is true, Hermione answered in a tone that said she still didn't agree. You still acted as a bad example to a lot of other students that did suffer from those things. Yeah, but they are the ones who chose to do it. Besides, it could be argued that in this particular case the benefits of forming new friendships with our housemates are greater in the long term than any of the minor consequences of last night anyway. Harry sighed and ran his hand through his hair, which did absolutely nothing to change the short spikes it was in. Regardless, people who decide they don't like or just don't want to follow a rule are going to find a way around it. It's hard enough to try and keep people from breaking rules in ways that do harm others. Wasting your time trying to convince people who are never going to listen not to break rules that at worst only harm themselves is ultimately going to be, well, a waste of time. Not to mention drive people away from you. Hermione had already been opening her mouth to make a retort when Harry's last sentence made her shut it with an audible click as she looked down at the floor and thought as they walked. Harry was content to give her time to think through his words, so they continued through the incredibly confusing hallways of Hogwarts vaguely in the direction of the Great Hall for another minute in silence. Finally Hermione looked up at him and asked quietly, "Do I drive people away like that?" Harry sighed before answering, "I've known you for less than 24 hours, so you probably know the answer to that question better than I do. But a lot of people who place high importance on following the rules tend to, well, no offense, but they tend to harp on about them to everyone around them who they see breaking rules. It's okay to explain your reasoning about why someone shouldn't do something, but if someone is going to do it anyway, going on and on about it doesn't do anything other than annoy them most of the time. If you want to follow the rules, more power to you. You should do it for your own good though. If others want to break the rules, as long as they are not hurting anyone, you need to be willing to let it go. You don't have to join them if you don't want to, but you have to let others make up their own minds, and maybe learn their own lessons from the consequences of taking those actions, if it comes to that. And even allow them to learn from their own mistakes sometimes. Or yes, you will drive them away." He then gave her a comforting smile and continued, "Which I hope you don't do, because you seem like a very interesting and intelligent person. If you are willing to let people make up their own minds rather than force your own views on them, I think a lot of people will want to be friends with you." Hermione's smile was a little tentative, and it was clear that she was still considering the implications of the conversation. But Harry was fairly certain that she would take it the right way once she worked everything out in her head. The girl who reminded him so much of Sakura clearly had poor social skills and a skewed view of human interactions. But that was something he could help her with, and if she was willing to work with him, he looked forward to getting to know her better. Breakfast had been a fairly quiet affair, at least initially. Hermione was still clearly working through her issues, so while they did speak about small things in an effort to get to know one another better, there were also long gaps in the conversation. And Harry left her to it. They could discuss it more in the future, but for now, he gave Hermione her space. Eventually most of the rest of Gryffindor joined them, and things livened up quite a bit. This was especially true once the Weasley twins showed up and started carrying on as appeared to be usual for them. Though apart from the occasional long considering glance in Harry's direction, they seemed to be ignoring the events of the previous night. They probably hadn't realized that most of the night's adventure had been a prank on them at Harry's hands. Not that he expected them to realize that any time soon, but that didn't make it any less funny. He did hope he could be there for their expressions when they did finally realize the degree to which a first year had screwed with their heads before classes even started. That should be almost as entertaining as their reactions last night had been. But eventually Professor McGonagall came around and passed out the schedules for the year, so Harry quickly gathered Hermione, Ron, and Neville together to grab their books from the Gryffindor Tower and start their search for the Transfiguration classroom, which it turned out was first on Monday mornings. The castle continued to be a little frustrating with its unwillingness to conform to basic three-dimensional space, making finding the right way to get to a given location a little difficult. But fortunately the four of them left half an hour before class started, and so managed to arrive almost 10 minutes early as the first people in the classroom. Well, the first except for the cat sitting on the teacher's desk in the front. Though he wasn't sure it was actually a cat. Apart from the Cerberus of the prior night, it was the most magical animal he had seen yet. The magic was far too complicated for him to have any idea what the cat could do with it at this early stage in his magical training, but it was definitely too much magic for it to just be a normal cat. Perhaps one of those Kneazles that he had seen mentioned in his books. But he disregarded that as unimportant for now and physically dragged Hermione to the back of the classroom with Ron and Neville, in spite of her obvious struggles to escape and sit in the front. But she didn't end up saying anything, so Harry just manhandled her into the seat next to his, giving her a bright grin in response to her annoyed glare at the treatment. But she quickly seemed to forget her anger as the four got into a conversation about what sorts of things they might learn to use Transfiguration for this year as other students slowly trickled in. Eventually the last couple students hurried into the room several minutes before 8:30, when the class was scheduled to begin. Once the last student had taken his seat, everyone began looking around for Professor McGonagall. Like Harry, the others in the class really didn't think that McGonagall was the sort to be late to her own class, but as the minutes ticked by, it seemed more and more likely. Then, rather suddenly and without warning at the exact scheduled beginning of the class, the cat which had long been sitting quietly on the desk leaped off, rapidly transforming into Professor McGonagall before her feet even touched the ground. Without pausing for any questions or even allowing the murmurs of amazement which began to sweep through the room, the stern professor began her speech. "Welcome to my class. I am Professor McGonagall, and this is Transfiguration, which is the art of changing the form of things. Transfiguration is an incredibly useful and versatile art which will serve you well throughout your lives should you put the necessary time and effort into learning it. But Transfiguration is also some of the most complex and dangerous magic you will learn at Hogwarts," she continued with a threatening tone. Anyone messing around in my class will leave and not come back. You have been warned. She then demonstrated several uses of transfiguration which were probably far too advanced for first years. They were interesting though. Apparently not only could objects be changed into different objects, but even into living organisms, which was demonstrated by turning a desk into a pig and back. This was rather fascinating to Harry, because although he could create objects, animals, or whatever else he wanted from nothing with the extremely advanced chakra technique, the creation of all things, he could not change the form of something which already existed. So the idea of being able to do so with magic, especially when it was simple enough to be taught to 11-year-olds, greatly interested him. Unfortunately, after that initial demonstration, most of the rest of the class was fairly boring. Professor McGonagall seemed to be a decent teacher, if a bit excessively stern. But Transfiguration on Mondays was a double class, meaning it lasted slightly over 3 hours. That was a long time to go over a bunch of dry magical theory and transfiguration laws Harry was pretty sure he could figure out a way to break by the end of the year. After all, if magic could shift one thing into another, there was no reason it couldn't be used to change something into food or gold. Especially since animals could be created, which were just food which hadn't yet been cooked. Personally, he expected that those magical laws were created by the government to prevent the disruption of the economy and taught to students as absolute laws to prevent anyone from even attempting such things. But regardless of if he eventually found a way to break these laws or not, it was pretty boring learning all about them. Finally, in the last half an hour of class, Professor McGonagall began the first practical segment of any of the students' magical training. A wave of excitement washed through the class as the professor passed out a match to each student. Not even Harry was exempt. Although he could already create displays of power which dwarfed even the best Professor McGonagall could produce, much less the very first spell taught to first-year students, this was still his first foray into gaining direct control over his magic. And magic would someday open up entire new avenues of possibilities for him. But not today, it seemed. Once the matches had been handed out, Professor McGonagall demonstrated the basic spell to turn them into needles and set the class loose. It had only taken a single viewing of the spell for his Sharingan to memorize it. But as he very quickly found out, simply being able to make the wand motions for the spell exactly perfectly and getting his pronunciation just as the professor had demonstrated were not enough to use the spell. Even knowing the exact flow of magic needed to make the spell work didn't help when he couldn't control his magic enough to make it do what he had witnessed. So instead of ending up with a small needle, he ended up with a rather large explosion, given the size of the match he started the exercise with. Fortunately, after the results of his wand testing a month ago, this outcome was not totally unexpected, so he had already fortified himself with chakra before the explosion, preventing any injury. His desk was not so fortunate. Or the 3 pieces his desk was now in were not so fortunate, to be more precise. At least they had not been blown very far. One piece had just fallen into his lap. If blasted with enough force to break the ribs of an ordinary child could be described as fallen. The second slid across the floor for a dozen feet, and the last was still connected to the desk's legs, if barely. But right now the more important factor was probably that everyone in the room had stopped what they were doing and were staring at him. Well, Professor McGonagall was staring at him and marching over in his direction as fast as her legs could carry her short of breaking out into an undignified jog. "Mr. Potter!" she exclaimed in what had to be her sternest voice. "What did you do?" She then paused, and just before he could answer that he just attempted the spell she had demonstrated, she proved his earlier assumption about the maximum severity someone's tone could reach incorrect as she asked, "And why do you have a dagger?" This caused Harry, along with the rest of the class, to look down at his wand. It was only then that it really dawned on him that none of the teachers had seen his wand before. He normally kept it within one of the concealed storage seals tattooed onto his right palm, which allowed him to release or reseal it with barely more than a thought, just like the rest of his weaponry. And because he was so used to carrying around all kinds of various sharp metallic objects, one more hadn't really seemed unusual to him. He had known that most wands were wooden from his experience with Ollivander, but he hadn't really considered that the professors might object to him doing magic with a piece of metal sharpened to a needle-sharp point. Wands were weapons already, so what was the difference? I think the technical term is stiletto. He held up his wand to allow a more careful examination. See? No actual blade, just a point, so it isn't really a dagger. He gave a shrug while very carefully concealing his own amusement at Professor McGonagall's expression of shocked outrage. "Anyway," he continued, "this is my wand. Or at least it's what Mr. Ollivander gave me to use. And for the point, he said that would improve its quality as a wand or something. Something about how the shape impacts its ability to channel magic, but you would have to ask him about exactly how that works." And all of that was technically true. The fact that he had specifically asked for the point and that making it into a higher quality wand was exactly the opposite of what someone with unnaturally massive stores of magic, and virtually no control over that magic should get was irrelevant. Well, maybe not irrelevant, but certainly those facts wouldn't be appreciated by Professor McGonagall, and Harry wouldn't want to burden her with knowledge that might make her even more annoyed than she already was. It was really for her own peace of mind that she not know. Finally, Professor McGonagall reached up and adjusted her glasses as she gave Harry a disapproving glare. "And what happened to your desk?" "No idea," Harry responded with a grin he didn't bother to hide. "I tried the spell just like you showed us, and the matchstick, well, it blew up. A lot." With a very put-upon sigh, Professor McGonagall waved her wand, making the desk reassemble itself, before placing another of the matchsticks in front of Harry. "Very well then. Please attempt to not cause any more explosions today, Mr. Potter." To Professor McGonagall's great dismay, that wasn't even the largest of the many explosions which would follow. Harry was grinning as he left the Transfiguration classroom to head back towards the Great Hall for lunch. In spite of some mild disappointment that he hadn't managed to gain any measurable control over his magic, it wasn't particularly surprising at this early point in his magical training, given his immense magical reserves. "So, that was interesting," Neville hesitantly stated as the group walked through the hallways of Hogwarts. "Yeah, I don't think Professor McGonagall likes me much," Harry replied as he scratched the back of his head abashedly. "I'm not sure why. I didn't fall asleep in class or anything. Not even when the lecture got really boring." Hermione had been fuming since well before they walked out of class, and she could clearly hold it in no longer. "You disrupted the entire class. No one else was able to focus on getting the spell to work because you were too busy blowing up your desk. And the floor that one time too." "Don't blame me," Harry replied defensively. "She told me to try again." "She also told you not to cause any more explosions," Hermione ground out through clenched teeth. Ron, with what was starting to appear to be a normal lack of foresight for him, decided to break into the conversation at this point. With a friendly pat to Harry's shoulder, he exclaimed, "I thought it was amazing, mate. Especially that time you got the entire top of the desk to go flying almost all the way across the room. You even almost hit Professor McGonagall with that one. She really did not take that well, did she?" Harry chuckled along with Ron at this, but it proved to be an unwise comment as it swiftly brought Hermione's wrath down on Ron. Turning to face him, she continued her rant. "It was not amazing. It was destructive, and a huge disruption. Some of us were actually trying to learn magic, rather than waste our time watching Harry blow his desk up over and over again." "Hey! That's not fair," Harry interjected. "It's not my fault Professor McGonagall told me to keep doing it, and she is the one who kept giving me matchsticks. I think because she was trying to figure out what I was doing wrong. But it wasn't like I was trying to screw the spell up. The fact that I'm awesome even when I can't manage a spell correctly is hardly my fault." Hermione just gave a slight growl and turned away with a scowl. Though she did at least stay with the group rather than stomping off, which Harry counted as a win. Since the first Transfiguration class of the week was a double, that made it the only morning class on Mondays. So the group quickly headed back to the Great Hall for lunch, which passed relatively peacefully until Draco Malfoy decided he needed to come join Harry at the Gryffindor table. "So Potter," he sneered as he approached their table with Goyle and Crabbe, "I hear you were quite pathetic in Transfiguration. I don't know why everyone is so surprised. I could have told them that you were all talk." Harry rolled his eyes with obvious contempt before responding, "Well, if it isn't Mr. Bad Faith himself. Did you need something?" Malfoy sputtered incoherently for a few seconds before finally recovering. He seemed to force himself to take a slow breath to calm himself before speaking, though his normally pale cheeks remained slightly flushed with anger, if you couldn't otherwise tell from his fairly obvious glare. "I just came over to point out what some of us already knew," Malfoy scoffed. "That the boy who lived isn't so special after all. You probably only got into Hogwarts in the first place because of your fame anyway. Once everyone learns how pitiful you really are at magic, you're sure to get thrown out." Ron and Neville were both clearly fuming at Malfoy's words, and even Hermione had a growing frown, though she had also shrunken on herself slightly at the schoolyard bully's words. Probably based on long experience having to deal with people like him, unfortunately. But before Ron or Neville could respond angrily and counterproductively to Harry's efforts to belittle Malfoy, he smirked back at the boy and quite calmly responded, "Oh really, Bad Faith? Everyone else in Transfiguration tried and failed to learn how to turn a matchstick into a needle. I learned how to make explosions at will, apparently. Is it just me, or does that seem better to you too? So if you are done being jealous of me being so awesome, why don't you scurry along and find someone else to annoy?" "Why you?" Malfoy trailed off, apparently not quite sure how to respond to someone else speaking so condescendingly to him. But after a few seconds he yanked out his wand and continued in a furious tone. How dare you speak about me like that? I am a Malfoy, and you are just a blood traitor who can't manage the simplest transfiguration without screwing it up. Harry's lips twitched in amusement at Malfoy's attempt to intimidate him, but he managed to hold his laughter down. What was that, bad faith? He asked, barely preventing the amusement from leaking into his tone, and instead just making it sound like an honest question. Oh, I see. You wanted me to show you what I learned in Transfiguration today, was that it? He unsealed his own wand and casually pointed it vaguely in the direction Malfoy was standing, causing the blonde-haired boy to shift slightly away from him with a suddenly nervous expression. But the Slytherin quickly rallied and gave what was at least a fairly strong front to conceal his fear. It's not like you could do it with anything other than a matchstick anyway. And stop calling me that. I am a Malfoy, and you will respect me as I deserve. Harry just rolled his eyes again and turned away from Malfoy and back to the Gryffindor table, clearly dismissing him with a whatever bad faith. Harry also resealed his wand as he turned, using the movement to conceal exactly where it went. Besides, it wasn't like he would need it if it came to that. He would be able to feel the movement of magic long before Malfoy could cast a spell, even if he did try something. Though there would be some amusement in beating him with magic. Because Malfoy was very wrong about him not being able to repeat his success with making matchsticks blow up on a different object. While the control needed to perform any sort of transfiguration remained far beyond him at the moment, he had seen not only the magic used to change a matchstick into a needle, but also several other transfigurations McGonagall performed as an introduction into what transfiguration was capable of. From this, he had found that all transfigurations seemed to work along similar principles. First, the caster's magic was injected into the object to be transfigured. Then the magic was manipulated to cause the object to change form. The second step did appear to differ a little in the specifics of how the change happened for each type of object. But his spells were not even getting to that point. What was causing the matchstick to explode was simply sending both far too much magic into the matchstick and the massive fluctuations in his magic as he inserted it. Which meant that his matchstick to needle spell could be applied to pretty much anything and it would make it explode. Normally, once the spell got to the second part, if the manipulation of the magic wasn't right to change the object correctly, nothing would happen, but when the injection of the magic itself was causing the explosion, that didn't really matter. But fortunately for Malfoy, it didn't come up, since regardless of how infuriated the little prat was, he apparently wasn't quite prepared to cast the spell at the back of the boy who lived in front of dozens of witnesses. So instead he just growled slightly and called out, "Wait until my father hears about this," as he turned and walked away with his two bodyguards. Several long seconds passed before Ron burst out. "That was great! Almost as good as the first time you dealt with that snake back on the train." Neville nodded in agreement. "Yeah, it's really great to see you stand up to him. Usually he is always talking down to everyone. It's nice to see him get the same back every once in a while." Harry just grinned and slapped Neville on the back, clearly taking him off guard as the pudgy boy flinched away, but then gave a tentative smile back to Harry as he listened. "Hey, you can do it too. Bad faith over there's just a bunch of hot air. He has been told his whole life how great he is, but he doesn't actually have anything to back it up." The two other boys and several of the surrounding Gryffindors who had been eagerly listening and laughed and nodded along. Though if they would ever have the courage to stand up to the bully themselves remained to be seen. Once the laughter died down, Hermione hesitantly added, "Well, I guess so, but you really shouldn't have threatened him like that. What if a teacher had heard you? You could have gotten in a lot of trouble." In response, Harry shrugged before giving an expression of such intense innocence that no one would ever possibly believe it was real. "Threaten him? When did I do that? I just offered to show him what I learned in Transfiguration today. I thought he might have wanted some tips." Unable to hold the expression any longer, he broke down laughing before continuing. "Besides, no harm done, right? You need to learn to relax a little and have some fun, Hermione." If her huff of annoyance meant anything, Hermione wasn't convinced, but Harry did note the small, almost invisible smile she couldn't quite conceal. The next several days seemed to pass rather quickly. Like the other students, it took a little while for Harry to get a feel for his various teachers, and it was really too soon to make any final judgments. But so far, Harry was enjoying the Hogwarts experience a great deal. Transfiguration remained by far the worst class, and even that was extremely entertaining. It was the only class in which the professor kept asking him to blow things up, at least. Well, she hadn't used those exact words, but given that blowing things up was the result of every transfiguration spell he attempted and she kept asking him to do it again, he wasn't sure how else you could describe it, regardless of Hermione's many frustrated attempts. For that matter, keeping himself from bursting out laughing at Professor McGonagall's mounting frustration with his attempts was becoming more difficult. She seemed mildly obsessed with figuring out why his perfect wand movements and spell pronunciations were having such abysmal results. At first she had been convinced it was because of his wand, but apparently after having a conversation with Ollivander at Harry's urging, she had dropped that line of inquiry. He could have told her that because transfiguration was the area of spellcasting which required the greatest finesse and control over your magic, he was channeling not just far too much power, but an inconsistent flow of power into the object to be transfigured, causing it to blow up. It was something he was quite familiar with from his original attempts at chakra control and early difficulties with similarly sensitive areas of chakra manipulation in his prior life. Unfortunately, he couldn't exactly explain to McGonagall how he understood exactly where his difficulties were coming from, so she would have to figure it out on her own. In the meantime, he found the process rather amusing, as did most of the other students. And most of his other classes were going significantly better. Fortunately, it had turned out that charms had a far lower degree of required control to make the spells work. He did tend to massively overcharge the spells, but unlike transfiguration, this generally didn't make the spells outright fail, but instead just made them a lot more powerful. Unfortunately so in some cases. For example, the Lumos spell they had learned in the first class had produced a light so bright it had temporarily damaged the sight of about half the class to the extent they required a trip to the hospital wing. Still, at least the magic worked, and he was perfectly willing to put in the time and effort learning to tone down such spells to a more reasonable level. And unlike McGonagall, who continued to become more and more frustrated and almost angry with him, Flitwick seemed quite excited by the whole spectacle. Of course, from then on his first attempts at a spell were performed in a shielded area Flitwick created, but that wasn't really a problem. Herbology was a lot of fun too. He had always enjoyed gardening, and having actively aggressive plants made the whole process a lot more interesting. And the occasional subtle use of the Mokutan bloodline effectively gave him a green thumb of absurd proportions. While technically the Mokutan was a wood-control bloodline, over the centuries of his use of the ability, Harry had learned to use it to control any sort of plants. Even magical ones, it turned out, though they were marginally more difficult to manipulate. And the possibilities of all of the different things various magical plants were capable of, or would be capable of when combined with the use of the Mokutan, kept Harry very interested in the subject. And his other three classes, astronomy, defense against the dark arts, and history, were all effectively free periods, which he enjoyed. While they were told that the knowledge of astronomy was required in planning of most advanced rituals, and even some high-end potions brewing, nothing he learned in that class was really necessary to him personally. With the Sharingan, he could map the entire night sky in moments, recalling anything that could be found in it instantly and with greater clarity than all but the best modern telescopes, much less the pathetic medieval ones Hogwarts had them using. He could find any sort of required celestial alignments already if it ever came up, so spending years memorizing various constellations and star movements was really unnecessary. At least Professor Sinistra seemed fine with him leaving early after the couple minutes it took for him to fill out that night's star chart. Well, she let him go as soon as she got over her amazement that he had completed an assignment meant to take an hour without even using his telescope. Defense against the dark arts was the area of magic that Harry was by far the least interested in. He already knew how to kill people more effectively than any school would ever teach. Adding magical methods seemed relatively unnecessary. He was far more interested in the other things magic could do than in the ability to throw some pointless curses around. Apart from possible pranking applications, he really couldn't see much point in most of it. And even those potential pranking applications were for the most part rather childish, though he would still plan on learning them eventually. Fortunately, the teacher was totally useless, and Harry could safely ignore him to work on more interesting things during class, such as his continued studies into ancient runes. And history of magic was best of all. Not only did he not need to pay attention in class, but the ghost who taught the class apparently didn't even notice if you actively slept right in front of him. It was practically ideal. Eventually Harry would probably just start sending shadow clones to those classes. There wasn't any point in him attending when he could be working towards greater, or any, control over his magic as well as the regular ongoing physical training he continued to put himself through. So the only class left that he had yet to attend was Potions, a class which was quickly growing to near legendary levels in the minds of the first years as the older students told them all about their own experiences with the infamous Professor Snape. Everyone else was quickly becoming rather terrified as the stories grew. Even Hermione seemed nervous when the topic came up. Harry, on the other hand, was almost giddy with anticipation. Apparently not only did Snape unreasonably dislike him for some unknown reason, he was also just generally a terrible teacher and thoroughly unpleasant person. Which was all the excuse Harry needed to move past minor petty pranks and really mess with the man. The only problem was that Harry had to remind himself that he couldn't go too hard on the poor guy. He hadn't really done anything significant to Harry yet at this point, and Harry always preferred to dish out well-deserved justice with his pranks rather than preemptively target someone just because they were likely to do something stupid in the future. Unless it was really funny. Then it was okay. Still, even limiting himself to a more reasonable level of vindictiveness for the time being, tomorrow was going to be fun. Chapter 11, Potions Class. Harry was excited. "I'm excited!" he exclaimed in a chipper voice, having decided that this was information the Gryffindors who surrounded him at the breakfast table should know. He really thought that they should be too, though their looks of incredulous shock were a strange way of showing it if so. Of course, he was used to people not being able to match his excitement. Few people could when he got worked up. But Sakura had always said he should make sure to inform his friends when he got wound up like this. Something about giving them time to leave the country, or something along those lines. He hadn't really been paying attention. He supposed it was polite to give them a heads up to watch out for the coming entertainment though, even if that probably wasn't what Sakura had meant. Harry. Ron hesitated, apparently not sure how to phrase his comment. But eventually he rushed ahead and said, "No one gets excited about going to potions. Well, maybe the snakes, but not Gryffindors. Did you hear what the upper years were saying about his classes? I don't think that even the Claws actually look forward to Snape," he added with amazement. "Well, I will have you know that I am quite looking forward to it. Potions sounds like such a fascinating subject," Hermione commented with bright eyes, though the way she immediately returned to biting her lower lip conveyed she was clearly nervous as well. "It's not the subject so much as who teaches it, Hermione," Ron responded with a tone of finality. As when the eyes of the first-year Gryffindors turned towards the head table, where fortunately Professor Snape wasn't glaring balefully at them, as seemed to be one of his favorite hobbies. Well, glaring balefully at Harry. The rest of Gryffindor seemed to just be a bonus. "Maybe he won't be so bad," Neville said hesitantly, though it was clear that he didn't actually believe it, and was likely the most frightened of the first years at the very idea of the quickly approaching class. "Come on, guys, it's going to be awesome!" Harry grinned with a slight sinister light in his eyes. But before he could continue, one of the Weasley twins leaned over to say, "Are you planning something, Harry? Something to make?" The other twin continued for him. "Your first potions class a little more interesting, shall we say?" The first finished the question. "Oh, you just have to take pictures of his face when you prank him?" The two looked back at each other and grinned widely before looking back to Harry and continuing to finish the other's sentences. "I don't think anyone has ever dared to prank Snape on the very first day of their first-year classes." "Prank him?" Harry asked with his very best innocent expression. "Why, I would never prank a professor, regardless of how awful he seems to be from what everyone says about him." He waited long enough to savor the twins' crushed expressions, not to mention that of most of the rest of Gryffindor. Though Hermione at least seemed relieved. "No, that would be wrong," he stated sanctimoniously. "On the other hand, I've always been a very lucky person. I mean, a Dark Lord used a death curse that never fails on me, and Karma chose that exact moment to bitch slap him for it." Ignoring the uncomfortable shifting at this comment, Harry continued to muse in a thoughtful tone. "I suppose it is possible that should Professor Snape fail as a teacher to the extent you have described, that karma might turn against him a bit as well. Perhaps even in amusing ways. That's how it often seems to work around me anyway. Through no fault of my own, of course." The twins were back to grinning at this point, though Hermione was likewise back to chewing her lip nervously. "Ah, yes," Twin One said with a knowing nod. "Of course," the other agreed. "And I guess I could possibly arrange to have some pictures taken should random happenstance fall into place in such a way. I don't have a camera though. Maybe if you let me borrow one?" The twins quickly agreed with matching ominous smiles before they hurried off, presumably to obtain one. Hermione briefly looked like she wanted to say something, but she bit back her words and went back to eating hurriedly, though with the occasional sidelong meaningful glance in Harry's direction. It didn't bother Harry though. The other Gryffindors at least were now considerably more excited about potions class than before, which was certainly a good thing. 11-year-olds shouldn't dread the first class of the year like that. If Snape had to suffer a bit to relieve that fear for the students, well, he shouldn't have been such a bastard to cause that kind of fear in the first place. Be a decent teacher or even just human being, and you don't experience pain and humiliation. Any animal could learn a lesson like that, so he didn't see why the same couldn't work for Snape. Before he could consider his plans in Snape training any further, he noticed the distinctive white plumage of Hedwig swooping down in his direction carrying a letter. It was the first letter he had received since his arrival at Hogwarts, and Harry was a bit confused as to who might be sending him anything. But he took the time to give Hedwig a quick scratch on the head and feed her a strip of bacon before removing the letter and reading it. Dear Harry, I know you get Friday afternoons off, so would you like to come and have a cup of tea with me around 3? I want to hear all about your first week. Send us an answer back with Hedwig. Hagrid. Looking up from the letter, he glanced around at his friends as he asked, Hey guys, Hagrid just invited me over this afternoon. Do any of you want to come along? Ron gave a grunt that could be interpreted as anything, his mouth too full for any actual words to be understood. Neville shrugged indifferently, but he agreed to come. Obviously, he didn't particularly care other than it just being a reason to spend time with friends, something it appeared he still wasn't quite used to, but was eager to embrace. Hermione, though, quickly got rather excited. Oh, he was the one you said knew so much about rare magical creatures? I wonder if he can answer some questions I have. Some of the books I was reading were not very detailed. Of course, I'm sure there are better ones in the library, but I just haven't had a chance to read very much about magical creatures. Such a fascinating subject, you know. Before she could continue her somewhat rambling exposition, Harry laughed and interrupted her. She had to have been running out of breath anyway, so it was only the polite thing to do. Calm down, Hermione. I'm sure he will answer whatever questions you have, and maybe he can point you in the right direction for some of the more interesting books too. If anything, Hermione became even more excited at this, though Ron gave her a look of disgust as she began waxing on about what she might be able to learn. Harry just laughed again as he quickly wrote that they would come for tea that afternoon on the back of the letter and sent Hedwig back to Hagrid. Maybe some people could become as excited as he did, even if they chose strange things to base their excitement around. Potions took place down in the dungeons, which rumor had it was fairly close to the Slytherin common room. It made Harry pity the Slytherins at least a little bit. He would give it an 8 for atmosphere, if the target atmosphere was ominous and slightly creepy, though that was probably in part due to the various animal body parts in the jars which lined the shelves along one wall. He wasn't sure why ominous and creepy was the target atmosphere for a classroom, but there was no way this could be an accident. He had seen plenty of magical smokeless torches around the castle, so it wouldn't have been difficult to provide a reasonably cheery and bright room for the students. Instead, Snape appeared to prefer a few scattered candles which gave off a dim red glow barely sufficient for a normal person to see clearly. Not to mention it lost some overall points based on the classroom being highly dank and slightly chilly, even in the first week of September. And worst of all was the lack of any sort of ventilation. While poisons had never been a particular specialty of his, like with virtually every other shinobi field of study, he had picked up a fairly strong knowledge in the subject over the centuries of his prior lifetime. Poisons weren't quite the same thing as potions, but they seemed to share a similar basis in the same way that seals shared a basis with ancient runes. So he knew that it probably wasn't a great idea to be breathing in random fumes of various bubbling magical substances. It wasn't a problem for him, since he could use wind manipulation to filter anything out of the air he breathed, but the rest of the students were not so lucky. Though perhaps the magical world was simply unaware of such things. The modern non-magical world had only discovered the effects of things too small to see comparatively recently, and given how far behind the magical world seemed to lag, it was quite possible. He would have to set up some hidden seals to filter the air in the room. In addition to it helping to protect his friends, it would probably also annoy Snape, since the man wouldn't understand what was causing it once he inevitably noticed the result. But for now he was more focused on more immediate ways of annoying Snape. Principally the illusion he had already set up. An illusion which activated as the man swept into the room with billowing robes and his typical sneer. There will be no foolish wand-waving or silly incantations in this class, the professor said as he took his first steps into the classroom. As such, I don't expect. He finally trailed off as he looked around, noticed that something was definitely very wrong. Apparently he wasn't quite as absorbed in his clearly memorized speech as Harry had hoped. But it was all made worthwhile when his expression slowly transformed to one of profound confusion. What, where? He looked around, clearly baffled at his surroundings, a bafflement which began to spread to the other students who couldn't see anything wrong with the classroom. At this point Snape's wand appeared out of his sleeve and he murmured a quiet "Tempest," and looked over the glowing numbers which formed into the current time before looking back over the classroom with a still clearly confused expression. Professor Snape?" Malfoy asked from the Slytherin side of the classroom in a tone indicating he was just as confused as Snape appeared to be, though clearly in his opinion for significantly better reason. "Are you all right?" But Snape just ignored the young Slytherin as he continued to examine his surroundings before finally turning and slowly walking back towards the exit to the classroom. It was Hermione who first grasped the basics of what was going on as she asked in a voice that wavered between horrified and accusatory. "What did you do to Professor Snape?" Or at least as much of those emotions as it was possible to inject into something quiet enough that it could barely even be called a whisper. Harry was relatively certain that she wasn't going to buy his innocent act this time, especially as other Gryffindors nearby started to catch on and quiet chuckles spread in widening circles around Harry's seat. They might not have been sure exactly what was going on, but after the conversation at breakfast, he was relatively certain that even the more clueless Gryffindors knew he was responsible somehow. Not that it mattered. No one could prove anything at all. And fortunately for Harry, he didn't have to respond to Hermione's question because Snape had reached the doorway and stuck his head outside of the classroom to look around. This caused the quiet questions of what exactly was wrong with Snape to rise in volume, and provided an opportune excuse for Harry to ignore Hermione. After a few seconds, the once again scowling professor drew his head back into the classroom, at which point Harry dropped the genjutsu he had earlier placed on the man. The reaction was immediate. Snape turned around to face the inside of the classroom once more and gave a yelp which Harry was fairly certain was very unlike him as he leaped back, actually jumping into the hallway, and almost falling over as he stumbled outside. This just caused more snickers from the Gryffindors, and greater confusion from the Slytherin. But this didn't last long as Snape quickly strode back into the room, his robes billowing just as they had in his original entrance. Except this time, rather than a haughty sneer, the man was openly furious. The amusement which had spread across at least one side of the classroom quickly wilted under the man's expression as he scanned over the students until his gaze fell on Harry. "Potter!" Snape very nearly growled. "You did this!" Harry already had an innocent expression prepared from Hermione's question of a handful of seconds ago, so all he did was widen his eyes even further, affecting being startled at the accusation. Hesitantly he asked the glaring man. What do you mean, Professor Snape? You made me not able to see you or any of the other students. It was just an empty room." He paused long enough to sweep his fierce glower across the room, presumably to discourage any laughter before continuing. "Don't try and lie, Potter. Just like your father to try and slip out of things even when you are obviously responsible. 30 points from Gryffindor for doing such a thing to a professor." "You can't see us?" Harry asked in amazement. He widened his eyes even further, now as wide as possible. He also added a very subtle genjutsu which made his eyes seem even wider, giving an almost unnaturally extreme impression of a wide-eyed child. "Oh, Professor Snape, do you need help making it to the hospital ward? Maybe a potions accident or something like that. I certainly wouldn't know what would cause something like that. I'm just a first year, after all." Snape's nostrils flared and his clenched fist started to rise from his sides before he took a deep breath and regained his calm. When he finally spoke after a couple of silent seconds, his voice was frozen in the depth of its loathing. "Another 30 points from Gryffindor for your cheek, Potter, and detention. For a week, I think." He then whirled around and walked away, finally reaching the front of the class for the first time that morning. "We will see if you can learn a little respect in cleaning floors with Filch. Not that I have high hopes for it." It was only when Snape had turned away from him that Harry allowed his mouth to twitch up in amusement. Humiliation came in a lot of different flavors. The Weasley twins favored the more obvious kind, most frequently color-changing charms on the Slytherin's robes or hair or something similar. It gave some quick laughs, but everyone could see exactly what happened, so really it was just some people who didn't like Slytherins being given an excuse to laugh at them. But to make it appear that a man was going insane? Make his totally irrational hatred of an 11-year-old readily apparent to the whole school based on something no one else even saw? It might take longer, especially as there were likely many fully willing to accept that Harry had done something, even if they were not sure what. Besides, even if all of the students knew Harry was responsible, that wouldn't be how Snape would see it. A man like that would only see the people laughing at him behind his back. And that was a deeper humiliation that struck at the heart of how Snape believed others saw him. A man like that was well used to people fearing him. But laughing at him? Questioning his sanity, and witnessing him being bested by someone decades his junior? That would likely be a new and very unwelcome experience for the potions professor. Though it was not so different from the effects of Snape's constant humiliations of the students supposedly under his care, really. Maybe Snape would figure it out eventually. Probably not, though. The man was just too petty to ever allow himself to accept defeat in this sort of thing, much less actually accept responsibility and change his behavior. Though he expected that Snape's reaction once he learned that Harry truly didn't care about any punishment he could possibly give would be the most painful of all. After all, what did points or a house cup mean to him? And detention could always be served by one of his shadow clones. He needed to leave the castle to continue his physical training frequently anyway, so there was a fair amount of time in which a clone would be taking his place. It didn't particularly matter to Harry if the clone was sitting around the common room or cleaning with Filch. In many ways, detention was actually preferable, since he would rather spend time with his friends in person if possible. Once Snape reached the front of the class, he whirled back around to face the students, and quickly ran through the roll, clenching his teeth hard enough that it had to be painful as he ground out Harry's name. When Harry replied "present," quite cheerfully, the grinding of the man's teeth was actually audible in the otherwise silent classroom. After making it through the rest of the roll, Snape suddenly snapped out, "Potter, what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" "Oh, I have no idea, Professor. What would you get?" Harry asked with a bright, inquisitive smile. "You get a sleeping potion so powerful it is known as the Draught of Living Death," Snape responded with his own twisted smile. As annoyed as Harry's unflappable expression clearly made the man, any chance to bring a little humiliation back to Harry was clearly welcome. "Perhaps if you were not such a dunderhead who relied upon your fame carrying you through life, you would know such a simple question. Well, maybe even someone as foolish as you might know this one," Snape continued. "Where would you find a bezoar?" "Well, a bezoar is any mass found trapped in the stomach or intestines of an animal. Or human, I suppose. That's kind of gross, though." Harry gave an exaggerated grimace. But Snape just continued sneering with, if possible, even greater disdain. "Don't be a fool. That's the Muggle definition, which was based on stories of real bezoar from before the Statute of Secrecy. A true bezoar is a stone which sometimes forms exclusively in the stomach of goats exposed to significant amounts of magic. It is an antidote to almost all poisons. You would know that if you had bothered to read the first 3 chapters of your book. I don't know why I would have expected someone like you to do that, though." "Oh, you really shouldn't have, Professor Snape," Harry responded, back to his earlier carefree voice, which was quite out of place in the dim castle dungeon, and especially out of place before Snape's angry expression. "This is the very first day of potions class. So we haven't had any assigned reading yet. Of course I haven't read the first few chapters. That's alright though. I'm sure I will read all about bezoars this weekend. They sound fascinating. 10 points from Gryffindor for your cheek, Potter," Snape barked out immediately after Harry finished speaking. "And you should have known to read ahead of time. It is called preparing for class. Something I'm sure you know nothing about. But your fame won't get you automatic good grades here." The other students, Gryffindor and Slytherin alike, were staring back and forth from Harry to Professor Snape in something akin to awe by now. The Slytherins might not like Harry Potter, but it seemed even they could recognize how unusual it was for someone to speak to Snape like this. And while the Gryffindors would probably later be annoyed at all the points Harry was losing them, for now they instinctively knew that a confrontation like this didn't happen just every day. Or at least it didn't before Harry's arrival at Hogwarts. Still, they knew they should be grateful for the opportunity to bear witness to something which might come to be a legend of Hogwarts. Or at least gossip for the next few weeks. "Thanks for the help, Professor Snape," Harry exclaimed with mild excitement. "You should really put that into the initial letters, though. There wasn't any indication anywhere that we are supposed to begin reading over the summer before we come to Hogwarts. I bet you would get fewer dunderheads if you told us what was expected of us ahead of time, you know." "That's another 10 points from Gryffindor for that, Potter," Snape scoffed in response. "I suppose some people truly are incapable of learning. Now, what is the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane?" "Well, both of those are the same type of plant. Shouldn't you know that?" Harry asked in an inquisitive tone, attempting to make it sound like an innocent question, even though it clearly wasn't. But he didn't give Snape enough time to respond as he continued. "Both are common names given to the Aconitum genus of flowering plants. They are also known as aconite, devil's helmet, and blue rocket. It also makes a rather potent poison, which is where it gets most of its names. Shouldn't you be teaching this, though? This is the first day of class. My understanding was that professors were supposed to teach us stuff before we were required to know it." This long and rather detailed answer to his question actually caused Snape to freeze for a few seconds, as he blinked back at Harry in shock before he gathered himself and responded angrily. "Don't question your professors. That will be another 30 points from Gryffindor. Do you really think that you are too good to learn potions just because you are the boy who lived?" "Oh, it isn't that I think I am too good for it," Harry replied with a pleased grin. "It's just that I am never going to actually need to know it." He held up a hand as if to give him time to continue, as if that would have actually stopped Snape's reaction if the man hadn't been too surprised to formulate a response quite yet. "Of course, I'm not saying that no one should learn potions. Some people have to make them. It should just be an elective like arithmancy. Most of us can just buy whatever potions we need, so we don't have to actually know how to make them. From what I saw in Diagon Alley, the basic potions don't really cost much more than the cost of the ingredients anyway, which makes sense because they are easy and quick. And the difficult ones are not safe if you don't have a potions master to make them. So learning potions is pretty pointless for anyone who isn't going to become a potions master." I'm sure you agree, Harry stated with a shrug as if it was a foregone conclusion. No, I do not agree, Snape very nearly yelled in an outraged voice. His hands once again clenched around the edges of his desk. Potions is a noble art, and just because you are too incompetent to manage it doesn't mean no one should even try. And that will be another 50 points from Gryffindor. And another week of detention. Snape gave him another glare at this point, though Harry wasn't sure what this was supposed to accomplish, since he had been glaring more or less continuously since class began. But what did I do wrong, Professor Snape? Harry asked, returning to his earlier innocent expression. I was just answering the question you asked. Do we get detentions for answering questions incorrectly? I'm sure Professor McGonagall would have mentioned something like that. You lost points and received detention because of your lack of respect and outright insults, Snape snarled. I doubt you are capable of learning respect, Potter, but as your teacher, I shall do my best. Oh, I'm terribly sorry, Professor Snape. I certainly didn't mean anything like that. I deeply apologize for any insult I might have given on accident. Harry then smiled sweetly at the man, which he knew would only infuriate him further. And he was proven correct as the wood of the desk Snape continued to grip creaked audibly. But Snape didn't respond, perhaps aware that even the Slytherins would likely think he was insane if he started yelling at Harry for daring to humbly apologize. The fact that both Harry and Snape clearly knew that the apology was totally insincere wasn't really relevant. So the professor tore his gaze away from Harry with visible difficulty and gestured to the board at the front of the class as he gave instructions to the class of children who seemed to have just as much trouble shifting their attention from the drama, if it could be called that, which had taken place in front of them moments before. The instructions for the boil cure potion are on the board. Complete the potion by the end of class. The man then spent the rest of the class returning to an almost continuous glare focused on Harry with laser-like intensity. Harry didn't mind though. It meant that Snape didn't miss all the little things like the fact that Harry prepared a perfect potion, which wasn't difficult for him, with all of his various advantages. It probably wouldn't help him if he ever wanted to become a potions master and actually make original potions, which based on what he had been able to gather seemed to require an exhaustive understanding of potions' ingredient reactions and an innate feel for the potions themselves. But for the comparatively simplistic potions taught at Hogwarts, all that was really required was following very precise instructions. And precision was something he could do extremely well. With the Sharingan, he could actually see the magic of the ingredients, so when the instructions said to put half of a slug in, he could tell much more precisely how much he actually needed to put into the potion by comparing how much magic was in the various slugs to work out an average and include only the correct amount to make the potion perfect. He also had hand-eye coordination, which would probably be considered supernatural, so dicing ingredients into exact eighths, or stirring exactly 13.5 rotations were all easily accomplished. Snape clearly didn't like the fact that he was apparently very talented at potions, especially in light of his earlier dismissal of the subject as something not worthy of his interest. Of course, the man didn't seem to like anything Harry did by now. Even the few things he did in class that were not aimed at further aggravating Snape, such as helping some of his fellow Gryffindors avoid mistakes with their potions, were met with a swift loss of further points. Apparently that was disruptive. Harry made sure to place another genjutsu on him so that Snape, and only Snape, would hear a cheerful humming coming from Harry for that one. It lost yet more points that Harry didn't care about, and made Snape look like a lunatic yet again when he insisted that Harry stop. So a solid win in Harry's view. Best of all, it would probably take until one of the Slytherins pointed it out for Snape to begin to understand what happened. It was nice to know he could infuriate the man even when Harry wasn't nearby. But for the most part, he let the rest of the class pass in relative peace. He didn't want to push Snape too far after all, though with Snape's near-continuous absurd level of abuse for a teacher towards a student, Harry found it hard to hold back. But for now, he was happy with keeping things at a low simmer with his obnoxiously high degree of skill at brewing. Unfortunately, eventually the exceedingly entertaining class came to an end though as Snape called out, "Everyone bottle and label a sample of your potion to be graded and clean out your cauldrons. Class is over." The resulting rush of students seemed especially eager to get out at that point, though Harry didn't really blame them. If he had truly been 11 years old, he probably would have equally quick to get away from the glare which hadn't left Snape's face for more than a handful of seconds for the entire double period. Even if that glare was rarely directed at any of them. And Harry's bright smile in response to that glare seemed to disturb at least the Slytherins to an almost equal degree. So Harry let them rush ahead as he carefully bottled and labeled a sample of his perfect boil cure potion to take to the front of the classroom behind most of the other students. In fact, only Hermione, Ron, and Neville were hanging back at this point, though each of them stayed well back and looked quite nervous even so. So when Harry placed his potion on the front table, not even Hermione seemed particularly shocked when Snape accidentally brushed his robe's sleeve across the potion sample to knock it off the table and shatter it on the ground. Apparently not even her general faith in authority figures could quite stand up to the level of mistreatment a Snape had exhibited that day, though how long that would last was anyone's guess. Harry just smiled even more widely though. Well, smiled and seamlessly activated a modified replacement technique to switch the falling bottle with another from the desk. How unfortunate, Potter! Snape sneered with what was the first expression that morning that could really be called a smile as he spoke in a satisfied voice. It seems you have no potion to be turned in. I suppose I will have to give you a 0. And I think another 20 points from Gryffindor for failing to turn in a potion sample as instructed. You know, I don't actually think Gryffindor has any points to take by this point. Harry mused. He then bent over and picked up the shard of glass from the ground which held the label, which he held out to Snape as he called out. Besides, this one was Malfoy's. See? What? Snape practically screeched. No, that's impossible! He exclaimed as he grabbed the label which clearly read Draco Malfoy. Yeah, that's pretty unfortunate, Harry replied in a vaguely sympathetic tone. Too bad he has to get a 0 though. His seemed almost as close to the exact right shade the book describes as mine was. I would think he would get a chance to make a replacement potion, but I guess if that is what your rule is, he will just have to live with it. And I suppose the Slytherins can afford losing that 20 points better than Gryffindor after this morning. Harry gave a casual shrug as he trailed off meaningfully. But Snape apparently didn't find this as amusing as Harry did, as he dropped Malfoy's label back onto the ground and seized a handful of Harry's robes to yank him forward. If Harry had been a normal 11-year-old, it probably would have pulled him off his feet, but he found it easy enough to keep up with Snape. Potter! He snarled, with his face even more twisted with blatant hatred than his normal expression. I'll see you expelled for this. For what, Professor Snape? Harry asked with mild curiosity. For academic sabotage. For cheating, insults to a professor, and deliberate incitement of other students. Pick one. He spat. Literally spat, as Harry had to shift his head to avoid the spittle. Oh, that's too bad. Harry nodded sympathetically to Snape before looking over his shoulder at his friends, who were still standing at the entrance to the potions classroom looking at Harry with mouths gaping in shock and horror. I'll see you guys at lunch in a little bit. He called out to them with a casual wave behind him in their direction. I guess I have to talk to Professor Dumbledore for a little while first, though. Snape just snarled again, and yanked harder on the handful of Harry's robes he held clutched in his fist, while Hermione, Neville, and Ron continued to stare after him silently. Chapter 12. What's a little defiance between friends? Snape physically dragging Harry through the corridors of Hogwarts drew quite a bit of attention. The last morning class had let out just moments before and everyone was headed to lunch, so quite a few people were still loitering along the path the potions professor took from the dungeons to the base of the headmaster's tower. Snape didn't seem to care though. Neither did Harry. More witnesses meant more people interested in the potions class Harry had just attended, which in turn meant more people to hear about the man's humiliation and to soon witness his impotence against Harry. Because if Snape really believed that Dumbledore was going to expel the boy who lived on the very first week of classes based on mild backtalk and some pranks which could have been committed by anyone, he was truly delusional. That was what anger did though. It made people stupid. And Harry had worked rather hard over the past couple hours to put Snape into that exact state, though it wouldn't have been nearly as effective if Snape hadn't been predisposed to hate Harry on principle and blame everything on him. Harry still wasn't sure why Snape reacted to him that way, but he was fully prepared to use it for his own amusement. Regardless of why, Snape seemed content to stride through the hallways in a fuming silence, and Harry left him to it. The occasional cheerful smile and energetic wave from Harry whenever they passed someone he knew probably didn't help Snape calm down. Eventually they reached a large stone gargoyle which stood in front of the winding staircase presumably leading up to the headmaster's office. Snape barely even slowed down. As they approached the statue, he growled out, "Ice mice." The gargoyle then leapt aside, though Harry wasn't quite sure if the speed it moved out of the way was normal, or if it realized that Snape wasn't going to slow down if it didn't move out of the way fast enough. And the hand that wasn't gripping Harry's robes to drag him along was fondling his wand, probably itching for something to dare to get in his way to give him an excuse to unleash some of his aggravation. Either way, the gargoyle apparently didn't want to find out exactly what Snape intended, and had moved away from its position guarding the stairs well before they arrived, even at their fast pace. A pace which didn't slow down at all as they made their way up the stairs, apparently towards the headmaster's office. Once they made their way up the winding staircase, Snape gave a single knock at the door and waited just long enough to hear Professor Dumbledore begin answering, though not long enough to hear what he was saying, before pushing the door open and entering along with the bemused Harry. "Come in, Sev." Dumbledore trailed off with one long droopy white eyebrow raised. Eventually he continued after having looked over the two of them, who came to a stop in front of his desk. "Please come in and have a seat. Would either of you like a lemon drop?" He gave a kindly smile as he held out a bowl full of the yellow candies. Snape gave a rather waspish no, and dropped into one of the seats, giving a push that was rather harder than strictly necessary to Harry towards another. Fortunately, Harry was quite significantly stronger than Snape, so he ignored the man's push and gleefully scooped out a small handful of candy from the offered bowl. Popping two into his mouth, he replied with a voice only slightly garbled by two hard candies he was now sucking on. "Thanks, Professor Dumbledore." The slight pressure against his mind-walking shields told him that the candies were apparently dosed with some sort of mind-altering potion. Most likely either a mild calming potion or possibly a minor truth potion. Not that Harry could blame the man. If he had access to that sort of thing in his previous life, he probably would have dosed all of his visitors too. Though he doubted something this week would do anything against the disciplined mind of a well-trained ninja even without his mind-walking shields, but every little bit helped. "So, what seems to be the problem?" Professor Dumbledore asked with a cheerful twinkle in his eye and a small amused smile as he settled down into his own rather plush chair. "This?" Snape growled angrily before trailing off, apparently trying to find a way to describe Harry in a way appropriate for his current mood, and yet polite enough to not get him in trouble with the headmaster. Harry gave the seething man a cheerful smile and slurped rather loudly on his candies. "This boy," Snape eventually continued with a snarl, "pranked me in the middle of the classroom, talked back to me throughout the lesson, and deliberately sabotaged another student's finished potion." The headmaster leaned back behind his desk, with eyes widening to show his surprise as he looked over to Harry from Snape. He then opened his mouth to respond, probably either to ask for some clarification or perhaps to comment on Harry's continued happy grin in the face of Snape's rather severe accusations. However, he didn't get a chance to say anything as the irate potions professor continued his rant. "I told you this would happen, Albus. I told you he would come here with a swelled head, thinking he could get away with anything just because he's famous. I told you he would be as bad as his father. No, worse than his father. Not even Potter would have dared pranking a teacher on the very first day of his first year. I told you he should never have been here. I told you, but you didn't listen. Well, now you can correct your mistake and throw him out." Professor Dumbledore gave Snape a few moments to make sure he was done before he turned with a far graver expression than he had earlier shown and looked at Harry. At which point the man's eyebrow once again quirked up in surprise and he asked, "You seem quite accepting of this turn of events. Do you understand that you are in quite a bit of trouble, Mr. Potter?" "Sure, I guess so," Harry responded, still smiling. "These candies are just so good. I don't think anyone could eat them and not smile." A pleased smile appeared on Professor Dumbledore's face along with the return of the twinkle in his eye as he reached over and plucked one of the lemon drops from the bowl and popped it into his own mouth. "Ah, I quite agree, Harry. Most people refuse one when I offer, which I haven't ever understood. I'm quite glad that you see the joy such a simple little thing can bring. Regardless of whatever else is going on in the world, you can always rely on a lemon drop to remind you of the simpler, happier things. Why, once, when I was younger..." It seemed that the aged headmaster wasn't paying attention to Snape as he began to wonder over the marvel that was the lemon drop. Harry, however, had been watching the man as his glare became harsher, his white-knuckled grip on his armrests tighter, and his grinding teeth louder the longer Professor Dumbledore continued. In fact, Harry was beginning to have trouble maintaining his bright and innocent smile and not breaking out into laughter. He didn't know if the headmaster was just a bit senile, truly did love lemon drops that much, or if the man was actually going along with Harry's attempts to nettle Snape. Regardless, it was among the most amusing things he had seen in what had already been a very entertaining day. But finally Snape could apparently take no more and burst out. "Enough, Albus! No one cares about your unnatural love of a piece of candy. We are here to discuss Potter's punishment." Professor Dumbledore cleared his throat and stated in a far more serious tone. "Yes, of course." Turning back to Harry, he continued, "Mr. Potter, Professor Snape has had some very bad things to say about your actions in today's potions class. Can you explain your behavior to us?" "Oh, you mean all that stuff with the prank, backtalk, and potion sabotage Professor Snape was talking about?" Harry waited for Professor Dumbledore to nod his head before popping another lemon drop into his mouth and continuing. "Yeah, I didn't do any of that." Snape immediately straightened in his chair and turned the full strength of his glare onto Harry, not that it had often left him for the duration of this meeting. "Potter! Why you lying, little?" Before Snape could get any further, Professor Dumbledore cut him off with a rather sharp reprimand for the apparently generally easygoing elderly man. That's enough, Severus. The headmaster then turned to Harry and continued in a gentler tone. Can you please explain what happened from your perspective, Harry? Sure, Professor, Harry answered with a nod. Professor Snape was acting kind of weird when he first walked into the room at the beginning of the class. He looked around with an odd expression, then walked out of the room while ignoring everyone's questions. But he seemed okay after that. No one seemed to really know what happened though. Then I answered some of his questions, explaining my views when he asked, but I certainly didn't do any backtalk, or not on purpose anyway. And I don't even know what he is talking about with sabotaging another student's potion. Professor Dumbledore sighed and leaned back in his chair at this before turning to Snape. Severus, if you could explain your accusations in a bit more detail, please. Snape continued glaring at Harry for another long moment before he turned, now facing Professor Dumbledore, as he answered in a voice filled with forced calm, clearly barely holding his rage at bay. When I first entered the classroom, it appeared to me that none of the students were in the class. As I entered exactly on time for the class to start, this was highly unusual, so after a few moments, I left the room to make certain the students were not loitering in the hallways. As soon as I stepped outside, I was suddenly able to hear the students in the classroom, and see them as I looked back. It was clearly an attempt by Potter to make me look foolish in front of my students. Snape then took a deep breath, clenching his hands around the chair's armrests briefly once again as he gave a brief glare in Harry's direction before continuing. He then proceeded to spend the rest of the class answering my questions with a total lack of respect, openly questioning the validity of potions as a subject and dismissing my attempts to censure his behavior, or even give him point deductions or detentions. Then finally, when his own potion was knocked off the table, he used a switching charm of some kind to replace his falling potion with Draco Malfoy's, shattering it on the ground. Do you have any actual evidence I was responsible for that prank? Harry asked incredulously. This time he didn't wait for the headmaster to prompt his response. It sounds like some sort of powerful targeted notice me not spell, but I wouldn't have any idea how to actually cast something like that. I'm just a new first year, after all. Snape turned to Harry as he spoke and returned in what was apparently his customary snarl. You could have hired someone else to set up the spells. How would a dunderhead like you even know what a targeted notice me not is otherwise? Once again, do you have any evidence that I was responsible? Harry asked with just a twitch of a smile. Even if this was a prank, it could have been anyone. And I know of that spell because I was reading a book about ancient runes that mentioned something similar is often included in defensive ward setups. It didn't describe how such a thing would actually be performed though. It's just an introductory book, after all. I know it was you, Potter! Snape exclaimed, leaning forward in his chair as if he was preparing to stand probably to attempt to throttle him, or something similar, given his expression. Just like your father, you wanted to humiliate me in front of everyone. Well, it won't work this time. Severus, please calm yourself and remain silent until Harry has had a chance to explain himself. Albus interrupted, pinching the bridge of his nose in annoyance, or perhaps with the onset of a headache. Harry could see how regular dealing with Snape could cause a headache for anyone. The thought set off a surge of pity for the old man, having to put up with someone like Snape and not prank the daylights out of him. Professionalism could be pretty boring. Not that Harry would know from personal experience. It sure seemed boring though. But maybe his own pranks towards Snape would help the headmaster feel better by proxy. Surely anyone who had to spend any amount of time with Snape would wish they could prank the man, even if they felt bound by the responsibilities of their position to not go through with it. Anyway, that's all I know about the prank, Harry continued. For the backtalk, I was just answering his questions. Actually, on that subject, I really think I should present my idea to you. I think what upset Professor Snape was that I suggested that potions wasn't really necessary for most students to learn, since most of us don't ever really need to use it again after graduation. So I was thinking that you could create a cooking class for the first 2 years. It would teach pretty much the same thing, careful ingredient preparation and how to follow a recipe correctly. But cooking is something everyone will need someday, unlike making potions, Harry said with a grin as he popped another lemon drop into his mouth, careful to watch as Snape's face turned a darker and darker red, bordering on purple. And for those who are interested in going into professional potions brewing, they can take potions as an elective, and the rest of us can replace it with something we will actually need in our lives after graduation. Professor Dumbledore appeared thoughtful at that, though he did seem to be periodically glancing at the shade of Snape's face with some concern. Eventually the old man responded with eyes twinkling once again. That's an interesting idea, Harry my boy. Certainly it is something to be considered anyway. I suppose I can understand how such a revolutionary idea might not be taken well by Severus. But for now, what about the last issue Severus raised? Harry nodded, giving a slightly confused expression as he answered. Well, I'm not sure about that one. I wasn't really watching closely, but it did seem like the bottle Snape knocked off the table was the one I submitted. I guess I just really hoped that my potion wouldn't break. I thought the potion turned out pretty well, and I didn't want to lose my work like that. So I suppose it's possible that I did some accidental magic to do a switching charm, I think Professor Snape called it. I didn't mean to mess anyone else's potion up though. I didn't really mean to do anything at all. I mean, I didn't have my wand out or anything, so I don't see why anyone would think it was purposeful magic even if I knew how to perform a switching charm. Can we get in trouble for accidental magic even though we didn't mean to do it? At this point Harry turned on his most innocent expression, eyes wide with just a hint of worry mixed in. Professor Dumbledore probably wouldn't really buy it, but it would further infuriate Snape. And the headmaster had seemed content to go along with Harry's nettling of Snape so far today. Especially since Professor Dumbledore might have hidden it quickly, but Harry had seen the flash of true annoyance at Snape when he mentioned Snape being the one to knock his potion off the table in passing. Clearly the man knew Snape had been trying to destroy Harry's potion as well as he did. But Professor Dumbledore didn't mention it any more than Harry did. There wasn't much point, since all three knew the truth, but no evidence existed to prove Snape's actions had been purposeful any more than any existed to prove Harry's actions had been purposeful. Instead, the headmaster's brow creased beyond its normal wrinkles as he leaned back in his chair, apparently thinking deeply, before turning to Snape to say, "Perhaps it would be best to review the memories of the events in question to clarify things. Clearly your perspectives on this matter are a bit different, so an unbiased reviewing of these events might help for both of us." Snape seemed annoyed at this, but grudgingly nodded before Harry asked, "Wait, what do you mean by review the memories? You can use magic to show people your memories?" "Ah, yes, Harry, my boy," Dumbledore answered with a smile and a bright twinkle in his eye as he looked back at Harry. "A most marvelous magical device called a pensieve allows us to extract our memories and watch them once again ourselves, or share them with others. It's most useful in keeping your thoughts organized and reviewing old memories for details which might have been forgotten by the conscious mind. It is especially helpful at my age. Old men such as myself need as much help as we can get to keep up with all of the memories filling our heads." Harry gave a thoughtful nod at this. That did seem extremely useful. There wasn't always time for such a careful review, but if this device really did allow the perfect capture of every detail of a memory, there were any number of times in which reviewing memory for the details which were missed while in the moment could be extremely important. Even the Sharingan wasn't a perfect substitute, as it recorded only visuals. "Could I provide my own memories to perhaps show my side of things a bit better than what Professor Snape remembers?" Harry asked. He would need to be careful of exactly which memories he supplied, but it shouldn't be difficult to give memories which showed the entire period in question without anything incriminating appearing. None of what he had done in that classroom had required hand signs, so there had been no visible sign of him doing anything at all. But this line of thought was interrupted as Professor Dumbledore answered. "Unfortunately, because you are a natural occlumens, you won't be able to directly use a pensieve, Harry. You see, the defense of a natural occlumens is so absolute that nothing can get in or out of such a mind. This means you cannot give memories for a pensieve, nor can you connect your mind with one to directly view memories, since this involves the pensieve magically inserting the memory into your mind. Some pensieves do have a projection function that creates a physical image of the memory which you could watch, but this is substantially less detailed than the immersive experience of entering a pensieve." Harry frowned at that. Of course this restriction didn't actually apply to him, since he wasn't truly a natural occlumens. But he couldn't exactly explain that he used chakra to create immensely powerful mind-walking walls, which he could drop part or all of at any time if he wished. So for now he would have to go along with the restrictions a natural occlumens apparently operated under. It was too convenient an explanation to give up easily. "Are there any other negatives to being a natural occlumens, Professor Dumbledore?" he asked, content to continue to ignore the silently brooding Snape. Though the fact that the man did appear to have calmed himself somewhat was a little disappointing. Still, this was more important for now. "Oh, I suppose there are a few," the headmaster answered. "Mostly in not receiving some of the benefits available to a true master of occlumency. For example, a master of occlumency can project false thoughts, tricking a legilimencer into the belief that the occlumen's mental walls had been breached and they were seeing their true thoughts. There are also some spells or potions that can be medically beneficial, such as a cheering charm or calming draught, which can affect a natural occlumens no more than any other magical mental effect. Most agree that the benefits far outweigh the negatives though. First, that you have no need to put the time and effort of studying a complex and difficult magical art such as a normal occlumens would. And more importantly, any normal occlumens, no matter how skilled, can potentially have their occlumency barriers eventually breached. A natural occlumens has no such fear, regardless of the power or subtlety of the mental spell or potion. Harry nodded before giving a brief shrug and popping his last lemon drop into his mouth. Well, nothing I can do about it one way or the other, so there isn't really any point worrying about it, I guess. Professor Dumbledore gave a gentle smile at this and nodded his agreement as he responded. That's a very mature way of looking at it, my boy. It's never helpful to waste time fretting about what cannot be changed. Better to focus on the things you can do to improve yourself and help others. He then turned to Snape and requested, I suppose it is time to view those memories and decide what needs to be done about this little issue, though. Snape nodded, and the two men stood to walk over to a locked drawer, from which a large shallow bowl covered in complicated runes was removed. As always, the runes fascinated Harry, and he made sure his Sharingan recorded as much of the surface of the bowl as was exposed to him from his position. Such complicated runes might be far beyond his current understanding of ancient runes, but the Sharingan would keep the image recorded until he was ready to review it once again with a greater understanding of the subject. Once the bowl was placed on the headmaster's desk, Snape pulled his wand out and placed the tip against his temple, slowly pulling it away with a strange silvery substance which followed after Snape's wand like guided mist. He then deposited the silvery substance into the pensieve and repeated the process several additional times before both men dunked their heads directly into the shifting thick silver mist which filled the bowl. The next few minutes were disappointingly boring. Both men remained unmoving, and though there were many unusual and potentially interesting items filling Professor Dumbledore's office, there were far too many magical paintings watching him to allow for any sort of experimentation. So after using his Sharingan to memorize a perfect picture of everything in the room, he was at a bit of a loss of what else he could do. Another prank on Snape might be interesting, but he didn't want to push things too far this early, and he couldn't be too obvious right in front of Professor Dumbledore. Even if the man was somewhat sympathetic, his professionalism would probably prevent him from letting Harry get away with being too blatant. So instead, after a brief stop at the candy bowl to refill, he dropped into the headmaster's extremely comfortably chair behind the oversized desk and settled back into the ample cushions for a kip. Albus almost burst out with a chuckle when he emerged from the pensieve to find young Harry asleep in his own chair. That level of confidence, or perhaps simply not caring what anyone else thought, would make his own plans somewhat more difficult. But he had to shake his head in wonder at an 11-year-old who was not only willing to steal the chair of the headmaster of his school while said headmaster was less than 10 feet away, but who was so unconcerned in such circumstances he could actually fall asleep. Though Severus seemed unable to find the humor in the situation, to Albus' complete lack of surprise. "Potter!" the man snarled. "Get out of that chair, you presumptuous little—" Albus almost sighed audibly as he once again had to interrupt to prevent Severus from saying something he really shouldn't to a child. Any child really, but most especially not this child. But instead of sighing, he cut in before Severus could finish whatever he had been intending to say. "Harry, my boy. You slept well, I hope?" he asked with a grandfatherly smile. "That chair really is quite comfortable, though I seldom find myself with the time to do the same." As Albus had mostly expected, Harry gave a carefree yawn and stretch before smiling brightly at the two, in spite of Severus' glare, and replied, "Oh yeah, this is one of the most comfortable chairs I've ever found. I might have to come borrow it sometime." "Well, unfortunately," Albus responded, "these old bones do need a chair like that one. But perhaps you can find another similarly comfortable chair for yourself eventually." A little deprecating humor could help him connect with the boy, and perhaps more importantly, Albus suspected that Harry might truly steal the chair as a prank if he didn't draw out a bit of pity. And he was beginning to think that Harry might be successful in such an attempt. Best not to tempt fate. Harry just shrugged and stood to move out of the way, motioning for Albus to take his own chair back. Albus wasted no time in reclaiming his seat, and waited only long enough for the other two to take their original chairs once again before clearing his throat and saying, "Comfortable chairs aside, it would be best to address the issue at hand." Receiving nods all around, he continued, "I've reviewed the pertinent memories, and you are correct that there isn't any evidence of active wrongdoing on your part, Harry. And of course we don't punish accidental magic here. You could have perhaps been a bit more respectful in your responses to the questions you were asked, but Severus clearly overreacted with many of his point deductions and assignments of detentions. I think a loss of 5 points in total for the class is appropriate for minor lack of respect, with no detentions." Harry smiled in response to this, though Dumbledore thought he might have also smiled if he had been told the point loss and detentions would stand, given his earlier reactions. Severus, on the other hand, started sputtering in outrage, but was silenced with a quick look, for now at least. And once Severus quieted down, Harry responded, "Sure, that sounds fine. Though it doesn't really matter much. I wasn't going to go to the detentions anyway, and I don't really care much about points." Severus' glare intensified somehow at this, but Albus just raised an eyebrow and said, Well, you do have to go to any detentions assigned. You can't just skip them because you don't like detentions. He then gave a small smile and pushed a touch of magic into his eyes for the usual twinkle as he continued. I don't think anyone would attend their detentions if that were the case. Oh, no, Professor Dumbledore, Harry replied. It doesn't have anything to do with not liking detention. I'm sure detention with Mr. Filch would have been plenty of fun. The fact that this was said with a straight face was almost as surprising as Harry's other actions today, but Albus was given no time to dwell on it as Harry continued speaking as if his appreciation for detentions with Argus was unimportant. But if you don't have any evidence that I did anything wrong, it isn't right to give me detentions, so I wasn't going to go. Albus allowed the small frown of a grandfather disappointed in the actions of a cherished grandchild to emerge at this statement. Well, Harry, I can assure you that this is not the usual way things are done. Professors only give detentions when they feel there is a deliberate breaking of a rule, and unlike the loss of house points, all assignments of detention go to the head of your house for review before the detention is served. You will have to serve any detentions that are assigned to you, though. The consequences for ignoring assigned detentions can be quite severe, even up to expulsion for repeated offenses. Though Albus didn't mention that while detentions were technically reviewed by the student's head of house, they were almost never overruled. Doing so was seen as weakening the authority of the other professors in the eyes of the students, and only Pomona, ever defensive of her Hufflepuffs, had done so at all in recent years. Still, the rule's existence did generally keep Severus' bias mostly contained to just taking points. But whether Harry knew this or not didn't really seem to matter as the boy answered in an unconcerned voice. Well, if your system for detentions works, it isn't really a problem. I will be happy to serve any detention assigned for good cause, but I won't serve a detention just because a professor, as you said, overreacted and jumped the conclusion of my guilt for something anyone could have done. And as for being expelled, well, I really don't think the Board of Governors or the general public would be pleased with seeing me expelled because I didn't attend a detention that I didn't deserve in the first place. But I guess if it came to that, I'm sure Beauxbatons or Durmstrang would be happy to have me. At this Severus could no longer remain silent, in spite of Albus' repeated attempts to warn him not to respond in anger. Though Albus hadn't really expected Harry to push back quite this hard, even given his earlier clear disregard for authority. Are you threatening us, Potter? Severus growled as he leaned towards Harry. You will do as you are told or... Not even Albus was quite sure what Severus thought would happen if Harry continued his present defiance. In fact, he doubted Severus knew, as angry as the man was, but Albus couldn't afford to let him make a threat which couldn't be backed up. Severus, calm yourself, he stated in a kindly voice, with just a hint of steel beneath the surface. I think it is clear that young Harry didn't mean that as a threat, but just to inform us that he was aware of the many safeguards in place to keep the system of punishments used at Hogwarts as fair and reasonable as they were originally intended. And just as Albus had expected, Harry responded with a bright smile as he said, Oh, of course, Professor Dumbledore. I would never threaten a professor, and I know that a school as great as this one would never allow unjust punishments to be put on an undeserving child. How the boy said all of that with a straight face, Albus would never understand, but he did appreciate Harry's willingness to play along with the polite fiction they were both spewing. Harry even seemed genuinely happy about it, as if he believed that just because he was threatening them with a public scandal was no reason they couldn't be friendly and respectful. All of this passed through Albus' mind in an instant. He would spend more time contemplating these new developments later, but for now he just gave the boy a twinkling smile and nodded as he said, Quite right, my boy. I would ask that you come to me in the future if you do plan on skipping out on what you believe to be an unreasonable detention. I don't think it will come up, but it would be best if we cleared things up from the beginning, rather than escalating things based on a misunderstanding. Harry nodded and popped another lemon drop into his mouth. Sure, Professor. You can clear up anything in the future just like you did today. All right then, Harry, Albus said as he leaned back in his chair. Off you go. You had best hurry to the Great Hall or you'll miss lunch entirely. And with that, the boy gave a quick wave and strolled out of his office, seemingly without a care in the world. Severus, on the other hand, barely even waited for the door to click shut before he began in what was just barely short of an outraged shout. Albus, you can't let him just get away with everything like that. Severus, be reasonable, Albus asked in a weary voice, momentarily feeling every one of his 109 years. Dealing with one impossible child tearing down so many of his carefully developed plans without even trying was difficult enough. Putting up with Severus when he got into a mood like this and was unwilling to listen to reason pushed an already stressful morning beyond the bounds of anything he particularly wished to deal with. Unfortunately, the world had a way of seldom conforming to his wishes. Be reasonable, you say? Severus sneered contemptuously. So it is reasonable to let a child get away with doing whatever he feels like. pranking his professor, and mocking me to my face, regardless of how he tried to play it off. And then, not even happy with pushing you back to the mildest of rebukes, he threatens us to our faces, and it's reasonable to just do whatever he wants out of fear of an 11-year-old? Will he be running Hogwarts by next week because you don't want to upset your precious boy who lived? And all of this is somehow the reasonable thing to do? No, Severus, Albus responded with a heavy sigh. Be reasonable because you are treating Harry as if he is— At this point Albus abruptly stood from his chair and began pacing agitatedly as he continued. I say be reasonable because the threat you seem to believe I should have ignored is very real. This is no bluff. He is right that if he were thrown out of Hogwarts, which we cannot afford to do because we need to keep him close regardless, by the way. But if he were indeed thrown out of Hogwarts for refusing to attend a detention assigned to him with no evidence supporting his guilt, the public outrage would be immense. I couldn't protect you because I would be too busy desperately holding on to my own position. You cannot ignore the fact that he not only holds real power over us in many ways, and more importantly, he knows it and is perfectly willing to use that power if we push him to it. But he is guilty, Severus cried out in frustration. Of course he's guilty, Severus, Albus answered in an annoyed tone as he dropped back into his seat. We both know that. There was no true surprise when young Draco's potion was the one which ended up on the floor. And no one is that polite in the face of such antagonism unless they are trying to get under someone's skin. Which he succeeded at quite well, I must add. As for the prank, even the other Gryffindors knew he was responsible, though they didn't seem to know how any more than I do. Severus started to respond, but Albus interrupted him rather sternly. But it doesn't matter if he is guilty. No evidence of any wrongdoing exists, and without evidence, if I wish to have him see me as someone he can trust, I must side with him. And right now, you know as well as I do that very little matters more than having that boy grow to trust and believe in me. He must accept my guidance to stay within the light. Especially given his currently lack of respect for authority. That sort of thing could all too easily evolve into something very dangerous as he gets older without proper guidance. I wish you would learn to move past your own issues with Harry and separate your view of him from anything his father did to you almost 2 decades ago. Albus paused at this point and shook his head in annoyance as he continued. Destroying an 11-year-old's potion, Severus? Really? You are not a teenager anymore. Try not to get into petty prank wars with children. It does not reflect well upon you. Severus didn't even try and deny it now that it was just the two of them, not that Albus expected any differently. Severus did have his good qualities, but he could be an incredibly petty man, and they both knew it and accepted it. Which meant there wasn't really any reason to dwell on it further. So Albus continued in a more thoughtful tone. But if you truly cannot move past that, I suppose learning to deal with some minor antagonism now might help him be just a little more ready for the future. But while he might grow to dislike you without any true problems, he must learn to trust me, or all might well be lost. So target him if you feel you must, but know that unless you come to me with absolute proof of wrongdoing, I will continue to side with Harry. Regardless of what we both know of his guilt. Severus scowled even deeper and whirled around, his robes billowing as he moved towards the exit to the office. But just as he put his hand on the doorknob, he paused and harshly called out without turning around. Trust is all very well, but you are also teaching him that he can walk over not just the rules, but even his professors and get away with it. Not just get away with it, but be supported in it, as long as he doesn't get caught. Keep teaching him that, and this is just the beginning. He will get worse and worse until you have a monster on your hands who cannot be controlled. You'll wish you had listened to me then. Do you really want to repeat history? To allow Hogwarts to produce another overpowered, entitled monster who thinks anything he is clever enough to get away with is acceptable? The door closed with a slam behind Severus, and Albus leaned back in his comfortable chair with a sigh as he worked through his many contingencies, trying desperately to think of a way to truly salvage this whole situation before it spiraled even further out of his control. He would remain there for quite some time,